Welcome, everyone. It's so fabulous to have you here tonight with us for our third in our South Perth series of Living More Sustainably. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to be able to talk to you about water-wise, fertilise-wise, and fire-wise. That's the great holy trinity, and I really cut my teeth living in WA on the water-wise. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you about this tonight. It's such a powerful part of what's going to allow you to have a more resilient landscape, to be happier, and to get everything that you want out of your landscape. So the most important thing to start with, so we're going to have our wonderful PowerPoint that I'll play with. We're going to cut with a few different things. We're going to show you a little video. I'll do some demonstrations. And please, very, very importantly, we want you to be interactive with us tonight. So we've got Lexi on standby. So any questions that you have at any time, she'll write them up through the magic of a pen and paper, and I'll be able to answer your questions directly. But firstly, really importantly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Noongar Whadjuk country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course emerging. And I'd also like to pay my profound respects to this incredible country that gives us everything that we have and enjoy in this space. And we wouldn't be here tonight without the amazing city of South Perth and Yulia, who's worked so hard behind the scenes to make sure that you can get these fabulous events. I hope you think they're fabulous, all for free. So it's part of sustainability and South Perth's commitment to being able to help you do so much better in the space that you live. Okay, well, to get the ball rolling, so as I said, this is really about water-wise, fertilise-wise, and fire-wise. Now, why fire-wise? Well, interestingly, if you look at South Perth, it actually has some pockets of bushland and the threat of fire is there. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well, and how the city is really trying to balance the needs of protecting our bushland and protecting the urban infrastructure. So getting that balance right. All right, I always start these talks by saying that I do not work for the Tourist Bureau, because you'll see why in the next bits that I tell you, because living in WA is incredibly tough. I believe we have one of the toughest gardening environments on the planet. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But number one, we have the worst soils in the world. And if you're living in South Perth, you are living on grey, sandy soil, unless you're lucky enough to be right on one of the riverbanks, and that's probably more loam and clay. But for the bulk of you, you have those grey, sandy soils. And even if you've spent a long time building it up, you'll learn pretty quickly that if you don't keep adding those organic additives very quickly, it reverts back to the good old gutless grey sand. So we have officially the worst soils in the world. Interestingly, most of South Perth is what we call the Bassendean sands, and that is the dominant soil type. It's not Bassendean city, that's or space, that's actually named after this soil association. Bassendean, from your perspective, means grey, lifeless, and water repellent. And I'll talk a lot more about how we improve that. Then we need to recognize that we live in the fastest drying part of the world's driest continent. And even last year, people were saying, oh my God, we've had such a wet year. Well, it was actually slightly below average as of about 20 years ago. So I think of it from my own lifetime. When I grew up in the early 70s, all of our water that came into our taps came through what fell in from the sky and into our dams. And when the dams overflowed, that was a collective euphoria for the city, because that's where our water came from. Fast forward to 2022, and only about 7% of our water comes from the sky, 7%. So that means the other 90-odd% is coming from desalination and groundwater extraction. We are running to catch up with the impacts of climate change, and we've only dodged this bullet because we've been lucky enough to be a wealthy country, and we can buy our way out of trouble by getting access to really high quality water through desalination. And we've been gifted with these incredible aquifers under Perth, which has allowed us to tap into those. So otherwise we would be chronically struggling. We also live in the third windiest city in the world. So we have these hot, dry winds that are coming in, and they really berate and maraud across your landscape. So your job really is to be able to try and moderate this environment. The good news is, anyone who's come to live in this part of the world, it is an extraordinarily beautiful part of the world to live. And for most of the year, the conditions are like today. Glorious. You wouldn't want to be anywhere else on the planet, but we need to recognize this is a semi-arid climate. Semi-arid, not Mediterranean. You think of the summer we had, by any definition, that would be a typical climate that you get in Morocco, Turkey, Yemen, Saudi, all of those incredibly hot, dry parts of the world. And we have the illusion that we are a very prosperous and a society with large amounts of water. But the reality is we all need to do better with less. So that's why WaterWise frames this. And why fertilize? Well, you live near the Swan and Canning River. You know when our river has collapsed because of algal blooms. And people often ask, why does the river collapse? Why do the fish all die? Where do the algal blooms come from? Well, inadvertently, we have fed the problem because we put manures, composts, all of those things onto our landscapes. And when they leak through or run off our sandy soils, they just feed another plant. It just happens to be the algae living in our river systems. So I'm going to start this talk now and show you some of the things that we can do to make a big and profound difference. So slide number 1 is coming through. I spend a lot of time saying, why on earth do we build like this? These are pretty banal houses. They're cookie cutter. They're just your run-of-the-mill houses that are being factory built, if you like. And it's all to a specification that works very well for the developers and for the housing industry, but it doesn't really work well for us living in those conditions that we have. As I said, an incredibly tough climate. And when it comes to our gardens, look at that. The only thing you can say about that garden, at least it's not artificial, at least it's real lawn. But other than that, that has nothing that would encourage kids and the rest of the family outdoors. And then if you look at it writ large, look at what we have. We have these new suburbs, and I know most of South Perth is the beautiful leafy green, but the important thing to remember is we have to protect every precious tree that we have in South Perth, because they are the difference between the sweltering hot suburbs, where the place on the left that you can see, that could be any new subdivision in Perth. Those new suburbs can be anywhere from 7 to 12 degrees hotter than our leafy green suburbs. 7 to 12 degrees hotter. So we get a 45-degree day. If you can't afford air conditioning, then you are simply going to swelter and suffer because of those extreme conditions. And it seems very odd, and I'm going to be frank and say it seems pretty dumb, that somewhere we're burning coal, heating up the planet to keep dumb houses cool. So everything tonight is about trying to make sure that we can make a difference. And as I said before, we are the fastest drying part of the world's driest continent. Have a look at that graph. Look at the downward trajectory of water. We're not getting the stream flow. Each of those red bars was runoff into our dams. So again, even though we had a wet year last year, again, an average year, but wet by relatively new standards, the soil is so dry after these years of drying that most of that water was absorbed. It didn't actually have runoff. So we got a fraction of the runoff that we used to get feeding our dams, hence why we have desalination and groundwater extraction. So, you know, there's nothing fringe about this. There's no great conspiracies. This is just rainfall runoff records telling us that we are gripped with the big impacts of climate change.
Just have a comment through.
Okay. Yeah, that is true. Thank you for that. Yes, at least it has a white roof. That's right. Yeah, good call. Yeah, that's a start. That's like saying Stalin is slightly better than Hitler. It's not really that much, but you're right. Good call. Yes, I want to get some TikTok images going where we crack eggs and start frying them on artificial turf and black roofs and let it go viral and remind people the insanity of building your houses and surrounding them with conditions and surfaces that are designed to get hot. It's insanity in this part of the world. But if we are running out of water, why do we still see this? Why is this such an indicative thing that you'll see? And you don't need to do a PhD to work out that it doesn't matter how often you water bitumen and pavement, it just doesn't grow. So every precious drop of water needs to go into the soil to create plants. We'll talk a lot more about that. And there it is in all its glory. How do you grow? And I think this photo was taken in South Perth. You can see that's what we have. That's what we have. It's fundamentally a soil that makes it really difficult. The flip side, the good news, the Disney part of tonight's talk is that if we leave these soils, or if we improve them, in other words, if we leave the bushland unadulterated, we have some of the most beautiful, exquisite, biologically diverse ecosystems found anywhere on the planet. And if we improve our gardens, we are one of the few parts of the world where you can grow everything from mangoes to asparagus to peaches to pretty much every plant you could think of. So we have the ability to grow extraordinary arrays of plants. We just need to learn how to turn that sand into soil. And this is the only mathematical formula that you'll need to remember when it comes to gardening. Healthy soil equals healthy plants. And I'll talk a little bit later about growing food. And if you're trying to grow food, well, the food is only as good as the way that we treat the soil. So that photo there, you see those rather ugly looking things erupting out of the soil. Well, that is a massive good news story for the soil, because what that tells you is that that soil is alive, because they're the fruiting bodies for the fungi that form symbiotic relationships between the roots of your plants and allow them to be able to harvest, to forage, to get everything they need from that soil to be strong, vigorous, and healthy. So just like seeing earthworms in your soil, those mushrooms, toadstools, puffballs erupting out of the ground are telling you have strong, healthy, living soils. And one of the cornerstones of sustainable gardening here, and indeed anywhere on the planet, is that healthy soil is the engine for growth. Healthy soil will give you healthy plants, and healthy plants are then more likely to be resilient, to really be able to repel or grow through the worst effects of pest, disease, and the vagaries of our climate. And of course, if they're growing food, it's going to be nutrient dense and give you what you want. So everything is about making that soil healthy. It's the most precious thing that we have. And to get that soil to work, nothing has changed. The universal language of soil around the planet is organic matter. And it's the reason why you are here. Your ancestors were able to grow food using organic matter, which allowed them to have healthy produce, and healthy produce makes healthy people who can create eventually people like you. So it is the fundamental currency, if you like, of humanity. And you only need to look at parts of the world that have collapsed on themselves, where there are despotic regimes and people starving and mass dislocation. And there is a mirroring of the decline of that agricultural land and the fertility and the demise of the human populations. And we're no different. Just because we have NBN-ish, and just because we think we have all this technology, we are still tethered to those biological imperatives that we are only as good as the soil that looks after us. So that's a really important message for the broader macro scale of Australia and the world, but you can bring it into your own homes. And you're listening tonight, and I passionately say that you are change agents. You are listening tonight instead of watching Married at First Sight or whatever it is. You're here because you want to make a difference, and you want to make a difference to your home. And I would urge you to think, how can I make a difference in my community? How do I become a leader and really encourage and shape and direct the next generation of Australians to live more sustainably on this beautiful landscape that we have? So what do? We got to add organic matter. And the best way to add organic matter is through soil improvers, compost. If you're making your own compost, which we'll touch on a little later, it's absolutely the most precious thing that you can have. But a lot of people are going to be buying it in bulk or in pretty bags. That's fine. That's fantastic. You can do that. But the important thing that you need to remember is that you've got to add that organic matter. Organic matter is the staff of life in the soil. So the organic matter is firstly, it's all of our organic waste, which through the actions of trillions and trillions of microbes, they've broken it down to make it into compost, eventually humus, which is nutrients and plant available nutrients. So it is in its own right an inoculation for the soil. It's bringing that soil alive with all those microbes, those healthy microbes. And it is in its own right a repository of water and nutrients. And of course, it's got those elements in there that are going to help those plants to grow. So it's very, very important to add that. But as you know, with our beautiful gutless sand, within a couple of months, you're back to square one, because the sand doesn't have the ability to hold on to the water and nutrients. So what I say when you're growing your plants is, if you're growing your beautiful water-wise native plants, which we'll touch on a little later, you probably only need to add compost and clay, which I'll talk about soon. But if you're growing your food-growing plants are a little bit like a giant Hummer or a Maserati. They're going to need large amounts of fuel to actually get them to grow and to keep growing. So the food-growing plants need ongoing additions of animal manure, compost, fish and seaweed solution, worm castings, all of that sort of stuff. Because your food-growing plants, every time you pluck a capsicum or take some leaves or pluck a piece of fruit, you are exporting nutrients out of that system, and therefore you have to replace them. So your food-growing plants, again, like a big American gas-guzzling tank, need large amounts of fuel. And of course, in that case, what I'm talking about is, I think my has dropped off. Sorry about that. Bear with me a second. Okay. dropped off. It must be the rayon shirt that I'm wearing. It slipped off. Okay, so very important to add that organic matter, but it's that sliding scale. Your native plants, it's just enough to put the compost in to get them started, but your food growing, which I'll talk about soon, you need to be adding so much more and keep it going. But the X factor, the thing that's going to allow you to really transform your food production is the addition of those clay particles. The clay, bentonite or kaolinite, you can add zeolite or spongolite. All of them are fantastically important to get that sand to be turned into soil.
There's a big question here.
Okay, I'll just hold for a moment. We got a big question. All right, this is Lexi had to really plumb all of her skills there to write this. Do you recommend planting using an arid calendar year round, or is that a lunar calendar? Every book puts us in a temperate. Oh, I see. Sorry, arid cat. Yes. So I'll paraphrase this question. Every book talks about us being temperate. Look, the bottom line is you're far better off designing for systems or conditions that are the worst that we will get. Because if we design it based on it being temperate or subtropical, that might work until things are really bad, and then everything will basically fall apart. So I always say to people, for instance, when you're designing landscapes, design for plants that can tolerate 500 or 600 mils of rain, because some years that's what we'll get. So it's always better to design for the worst conditions that you can expect. And does planting according to the arid calendar work? So in other words, it does if the arid section is in this latitude. So in other words, if I was planting in the wheat belt on sandy soil, so that's getting into arid, I would, particularly in some bad years, I would still be looking at planting at the beginning of winter as we're doing now. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So yes, even though a lot of books will talk us temperate, again, this is often written from a big macro perspective, but we are looking at it really from the West Australian home conditions. Okay, so how do you get the clay? There are lots of ways you can get clay now. You can get it from Dawson's garden centres, from Bunnings, most places like Better Pets and Gardens, City Farmers, they all sell it. You can get it in bulk from big rural stockists. So anyone that sells horse feed and that sort of stuff, you can get that in bulk. Bentonite is probably the cheapest, but the important thing to remember is all clays are going to add benefit to your soil. It's the most precious thing. And I'll do the recipe fairly soon on turning that sand into soil. So we're going to cut in a moment to that. But the important thing is it's that mixture of clay and compost, the clay and the compost that's going to transform your soil, because the clay becomes the mortar between the bricks. And this is the thing that breaks everyone's heart, the water repellency. Look at it in all its glory. So that is what happens because of a unique combination of a lot of our vegetation has a waxy coating on the leaves, and the microbes we have in the soil, when they break down all the organic matter that we add, one of the byproducts is wax, 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 wax. And what the wax does is it coats the grains of sand so the water can't get into the soil. So if we get a beautiful thunderstorm, hopefully soon, instead of that water going into the soil to rehydrate your plants and give them a drink, it either sits there and evaporates, or it runs off. And this is when it gets really sad and quite frankly, catastrophic for our waterways, because once it runs off, it dissolves all the nutrients, which is the compost and the fertilizers and the manures that you've added and a bit of dog poo, and then all the detritus from the roads. It feeds into a drain that feeds into a bigger drain, and then ultimately that now dumps what is a toxic slurry into the Swan and Canning rivers. And that's why we have such problems with the health of our river systems. For a comparatively young civilization, we have so much of a problem simply because our soils either leak because they're sandy and everything slips through, or because of the water repellency, it sits on the soil surface. Either way, it means we use a lot more water to get the results that we want, and we get that horrific problem of pollution. So we say it's so important we have an 11th commandment, thou shalt. Use the water and the nutrients where they fall. Use it where it falls. Get it into the soil. Turn it into your plants. Do we need to add clay and or if we're growing food? Absolutely. You put the clay in. It's absolutely critical if you are going to be putting in food growing plants, because you're putting more food in and you need to make sure it doesn't leak out. And bentonite is not too alkaline. And keep in mind, we're going to give the recipe for it fairly soon. It's a small addition for a big result. So it's not going to change the pH of your soil to the point where it's a big problem. And generally speaking, the soils of South Perth are slightly acidic. So even if your bentonite is a bit alkaline, it's only going to nudge it closer towards the sweet spot, which is around that 6.5 to 7. Here are some of the wetting agents that you can use, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. But the wetting agents are the first aid for the soil, the first aid. So wetting agents, when you add them to the soil and you get them to froth, they will break down the wax and allow that precious water into the soil, but they will only last about 2 months. So here's some good wetting agents. So the important thing to keep in mind is this is a great time to apply them right now. We've had a little bit of rain, but if you can scratch the soil surface and it's bone dry, then you need to be adding wetting agents. And it only lasts about a couple of months. So you should then be putting wetting agent on in around October, November, when you're moving to irrigation. When you're thinking it's time to put the irrigation on for the beginning of summer, before you do that, put the wetting agents on and get that to go into the soil. And then probably again around Christmas time. All right, we're going to cut to a bit of a demo to show you how we can turn our sand into soil. So we've got some beautiful sandy soil here in all its glory. Yes. So Woodsy's got this all prepared for us. He's siphoned out the cigarette butts. Well done. And the important thing to remember is that it is really quite visceral when you see what's happening. So there's my beautiful sandy soil, and I pour it on, and look at that. And that is the greatest problem that you face as gardeners in WA, because when that water is, as you can see, it's just not going in because of that wax. It's stopping the water going into the soil, and I'm imbibing huge amounts of the petrichors. It's released a large amount of compounds into the air, and it's really quite strong. Okay, so how do we turn that sand into soil? So I'm going to do that live demonstration. So the number one thing we need to keep in mind is we've got to add some of that beautiful clay. So here's our clay. So it looks fairly innocuous, but remember, this stuff turns into toothpaste if you leave it on the soil surface. So you do not leave it on the soil surface. You have to mix it in. And for those of you in the beautiful sandy soils of Perth and those grey sands of South Perth, you're probably putting it on at about 5 kilograms per square metre. And the key is we get it down to about a 30 centimetre depth, 30 centimetres. And the reason why we need to get it down that deep is because that's where the roots are of your plants. That's where the feeder roots are. What are the feeder roots? Well, they're the roots that are really foraging through the soil to get water and nutrients. So they're the real building blocks of getting our plants to grow. So I've added that clay. It doesn't look that different at the moment. Then, very importantly, we add our beautiful organic matter. Look at it in all its glory. It's the most precious thing. And when you put your red top bin out in South Perth, and that stinky bin, although all those things you're really keen to get rid of, most of that time that goes to massive composting facilities. And through the process of adding those microbes, they turn it into this beautiful compost. So compost is not only an amazing way of recycling, but it is obviously the most precious thing that we have to add into our soil. But again, if you don't add the clay within a short period of time, that sand is no longer going to work for you. It's going to lose its ability to keep working. Think of the clay as like the mortar between the bricks. Okay, so here's my unimproved sand again. I'll put it there just to showcase. Okay, and as we said, you just basically, you can see that water running off. Look at that. But look what happens now. Now, it's going to take a little bit of time, but that clay, look at the difference. You can see that clay is starting to absorb that water. And the big difference is I can grab this in my hand as hard as I like, and there's my unimproved sand. So I squeeze it as hard as I can, and it just simply falls through. But look what's happened here. Look at the water that I've been able to hold in there. That's soil. I wish that one of the great election pledges of state and federal governments was that we are going to help and assist every West Australian to know and understand and be passionate about turning sand into soil, because this now, which is soil, compared to that which is sand, is going to need half of the water and the nutrients, half the water. So imagine If 2 million West Australians all went out, got rid of their artificial turf, put real gardens down, but turned the sand into soil, they would slash their water consumption by 50%. There's nothing more powerful than that. And when you think the biggest component of water use in your home is in the garden. So about 48% of the water that you consume on average goes to the garden. So if we can slash that, already you will have cut your water bill by 25%. So when we talk about reducing utility prices, I don't think we need to be thinking of it from that perspective. We should just be saying, well, how do we learn to do better with less? And when it comes to nutrients, and it's an even better story, because you should be able to reduce your nutrient use by about 80%. Okay, so we've had a fantastic question. Well, how do we add the clay retrospectively when we already have it? I've done so many workshops and we say, hands up who wish they knew about the clay beforehand. And most people say, why haven't I heard of this before? And so I'll tell you those techniques in a moment. So firstly, that's how you turn that sand into soil. So to summarize that recipe again, so for us in Perth, we're looking at about 5 to 7 kilograms per square meter. 5 to 7 kilograms per square meter mixed into the top 30 centimeters. That's really important. And then we are adding a beautiful bag of clay, of compost, I should say. So if you're using compost, it's really important, if you're going to be buying a compost, buy a good quality one, and you're using about 1 bag per square meter as well. And can you see the red box on there? The red box with the white ticks. That's an Australian standard, which tells you that this is a high quality product. And when it's got the Water Corporation and the Water Smart approved marks, that tells you this is a really, really high quality product as well. So again, you go to places like Dawson's and Bunnings, you're going to find all of these beautiful products there. You can buy them in bulks if you don't want to use lots of bags. But the important thing is look for that symbol. That's a certification. And that means that the product is going to have the best chance of not having disease and or weed seed in there. Okay, so how do we add it? Well, if you are putting a plant in the ground, imagine this pot is my beautiful plant. Whatever the size of the pot, you want to dig a hole at least 3 to 4, maybe 5 times the size of that pot. Because what we're trying to do is make sure that our plants are being put into good soil, so that their roots start to realize that conditions are great and they will spread out in all directions. That's the secret of being able to create strong, vigorous, healthy plants. So whatever the size of the pot, you dig a hole 3 to 5 times the size of that. Backfill with the compost, the clay, some wetting agent, and the in situ soil. In other words, the stuff that's there. So that's one way that we can get it into the soil. If you're trying to retrospectively add it, you can dissolve the clay in a watering can. Dissolve it in a watering can, it dissolves really easily, and you just keep drenching your soil. Once a fortnight, once a month, get it there, and you'll slowly build the clay up. You may need to use the wetting agents first, that's fine. That will break down the wax so that you can get that precious clay into the soil. If you get only one thing from tonight, it is that your sands have a clay deficit, and you're trying to get that into 5 to 7 kilograms per square meter, and the transformation that will make is amazing. When we talk about our food growing, each time you go to replenish your beds to put your new crop in, add the clay again, because you're going to find most of that clay, it's exhausted. That soil has grown your food for you. It's exhausted after that journey. So you're going to need to replenish it with the clay, the compost, the animal manures, fish and seaweed solution, all that kind of stuff. So turning that sand into soil is profoundly important to get our plants to grow. Okay, beautiful stuff. So summarize that again, adding the clay, the compost, you can add it to whenever you're putting plants in the ground, a whole 3 to 5 times that size, retrospectively, dissolve it in a watering can, and just keep adding that clay. It's going to make a big difference. We're going to cut now back to our presentation because I've got lots of things I want to keep going through with. And as you start to view WA through the prism of sustainability, you'll look at a garden like this now with very, very different eyes. You might superficially have looked at this garden and said, that's a pretty garden, and I guess it is. But when you look at it through the prism of sustainability in this part of the world, what we do know is fundamentally that landscape is using huge amounts of nutrients, and probably 80 to 90% of those fertiliser components that were added are just feeding algae in our waterways or contaminating our groundwater. and I'll explain why. So this lovely lady, and that is a serious fertilizer spreader. So she's probably come off a farm. Most of the fertilizers that we use were traditionally designed for food growing. They were fast, super powerful. And when we put them into commercial food growing areas, we got a big crop very quickly, beat the weeds, got in with the weather when it was right. Farmer makes a profit, everyone's happy, and people in urban centers get fed. Cool. We just transported and used those fast-acting fertilizers on the Swan Coastal Plain of Perth for urban gardens, and it's literally been a disaster. So most of those fast-acting fertilizers, NPK Blue, Cresco 311, Potato E, they're all much loved fertilizers. Zest, Thrive, Miracle Grow, they're designed as fast-acting fertilizers, which means when you add them to sandy soils, and they're designed to dump all those nutrients quickly, the plant can't possibly take more than a small amount. So guess what happens to the rest? Wasted, down the drain, literally money going down the drain. So when you look at a garden like this lady has here, she is growing plants, but she is wasting massive amounts of nutrients because we're trying to paper over the fact we haven't turned sand into soil. So the golden rules when we're fertilizing is lush is a four-letter word. Now, what I need to do is explain that one to you. So firstly, what we need to remember is that it's going to take a little bit of time to get those nutrients from. Okay, so where do we find organic matter? I'll just interject with a question. From the FOGO bins, maybe FOGO. Yeah. Okay. So so you probably have FOGO bins now at South Perth. So it's the food and organic waste. So a lot of councils are doing that now. So the FOGO bin is a really precious bin, and I encourage you to use it well. So that means that stuff goes directly to big composting facilities. The big problem with commercial composting is contamination. The bane of any composting and recycling industry is people who are not effectively separating out their wastes. So when it comes to FOGO, it's only organic materials. Don't put any wood in there, any glass, any other contaminants, because that then renders that compost nowhere near as valuable. So that's where a lot of our compost is coming from. And so if you have a FOGO bin at South Perth, you can be assured that that is now being diverted to create beautiful compost, which is great stuff. Okay, so getting back to our fertilizers, lush growth, particularly in summer, is not good growth, because lush means they're fast-growing thin cell walls, which means the protection on the plant is pretty small. So it's going to be hit by the hot, dry winds, frosts in winter, and sap-sucking and leaf-eating insects. So if you grow your plants with fast-acting fertilizers, you kind of get on this bandwagon where they grow quickly, they're weak, so you then get duped into buying pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, miticides, and before you know it, you're on this treadmill where you're just spending large amounts of money and time trying to keep your plants healthy. It's the exact opposite of what we're trying to suggest, which is strong, resilient growth through building up the soil. It's the most precious thing. So the other thing in relation to fertilizer is don't fertilize when a plant is sick. 9 times out of 10, no, 99 times out of 100, your plant might be sick because the soil is water repellent and you just don't know it. You're pouring water on, but you don't know it's just sitting on the soil or running off. So the poor bugger is literally dying of thirst. Or it might just be the wrong plant in the wrong place. It just is not adapted to these conditions. Remember, this is one of the toughest gardening environments on the planet. So it's really tough for plants, or the plant has just got a weak root system. It's just been badly grown, it's oversized, so its root system is coiled and deformed, so the poor thing is struggling. Either way, that's 9 times out of 10 why the plant is not doing well. So don't fertilize a sick plant. Have a look at whether it's water repellent, and I guarantee if it's bone dry, if you put the wetting agent on and get that water into the soil, the miracle will be the plant will probably come back to life. Okay, the big thing we want you to do is go for slow or controlled release fertilizers. Okay, so these are designed to release the nutrients over time. So rather than instant, lush, and fast, these nutrients are basically drip feeding your plant with nutrients, and they should always be watered in. So here's an example of a fertilizer. I'll just cut to one now. Now, there are lots of fertilizers on the market. This is a very good one, but you can look at things like Grow Safe is a very good brand, No Frills, Eco Growth. They're all very good fertilizer brands. And what those companies are doing now is they're coming up with products that are better suited to West Australian conditions. So it should say on the side of the bag, the tub, the bottle, that it feeds for months. It should say that it's slow release. It should say that it's fortified with minerals and with microbes. Again, just as we now know that human health is really linked to our gut health, well, it's the same with our nutrients. So you're starting to see that good companies are adding this in. And if we look at the side of the bottle, the tub, or the bag, and I'll just get Woodsy to hone in there, you'll see that it is going to have NPK. Yes, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But we need to remember our soils are the worst in the world. Remember what it looked like, this horrible, crappy sand. So it's chronically deficient in trace elements as well, otherwise known as micronutrients. So the product that you buy should be a general purpose. So it should have nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but zinc, selenium, boron, molybdenum, about 10 to 15 trace elements as well. So slow release feeds the soil, and it's a mix of macro, that's the big, and the trace elements as well, because your plants are only as good as the suite of nutrients that are given to them. It's a really, really important part of that process. Okay, so that's going to make a big difference to keep you moving forward. So I think we might show a quick video to summarize this in terms of how we get our plants to grow. Yep. And so this is a video that I did with Garden Gurus a few years ago, which is really looking and summarizing all of those things that I talked about. Yep. Just putting it on full screen. If it isn't bad enough that we've come off the back of a long and brutal summer where we went 120 days without rain, we have to face up to the fact that we have really, really bad soils. If you look up close, you can see why. They're pale, they don't seem to have any life. You pour water on it and it just runs straight off. And you can squeeze it as hard as you like in your hands and it slips through. The worse, they just seem to go on forever. Despite these seemingly impoverished soils, Perth has been gifted with some of the most incredible ecosystems that you'll find anywhere on the planet. So, of course, this poses an intriguing question. How do you get such amazing growth on these terrible sands? Well, the answer is the biological life that's in the soil that sustains those plants despite those limitations. And of course, every gardener knows that if you want to support that life, you add organic matter and plenty of it. But in Perth, if we stop that process, within a couple of months, we're back to where we started with that awful gutless sand. Now, if we're really to come to terms with this sand and turn it into soil, we need to follow one of the most important recipes you'll ever know. Well, to turn this sand into soil, we need to add clay. Now, depending on the sand that you have and the product that you use, you'll be using anywhere from 5 to 12 kilos a square metre. This will make a profound and permanent improvement to your sand. But we're not done yet. Then we add beautiful, rich, organic compost or soil improver. And as I mix it, you can see already it's started to make a profound difference to the colour of that soil. But watch what happens when we add that all-important water. It sheets off the unimproved sand, but thanks to our recipe, the clay activates, grabs the water, and soon you can see when I squeeze it in my hand, we have soil, a wonderful mixture that will need half the water and a fraction of the nutrients of our unimproved sand. Amazing. All right. Now, it's one thing to do a demo on the back of a truck, but let's see how good this stuff is when we put it to the test with a real blank canvas. We turn this mixture into the top 20 to 30 centimetres because that's where the feeder roots are. Look at that. There you go, Chris. I've transformed a small patch, but this is now beautiful soil ready for your garden. And the thing is, this is not going to leak water and nutrients. It's going to save you money. And of course, it's a wonderful win for the rivers because they just bear the brunt of anything that leaves your property. Okay, so you just got to do the rest now. You happy with that? Yes, okay. Had darker hair, and that's what happens when you have kids. Suddenly the whole thing starts to implode on itself. So very importantly, that is just trying to, again, summarize just how precious it is to be able to improve that soil and get things to grow more effectively for you. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about composting because that's such a powerful part. And I know many of you are into composting. If we're going to learn anything about living more sustainably in Perth, we have to take our cues from nature. And nature doesn't have a concept of waste. It's a human concept that we just haven't learned how to use every resource. And composting, to me, is one of the greatest examples of reuse of resources. So what you're doing is you're taking that organic material and you are turning it into that most amazing product that we want to use, which is the compost to get your plants to grow. But there are some secrets to creating true compost, and that's what I want to talk about now. I think of composting a little bit like baking or cooking. You're trying to create the conditions where your preferred end product is this beautiful, wonderful resource. But it's also the miracle of life on this planet, because composting is trillions and trillions of those microbes that are feeding on your organic material. And we have a lot in common with those composting microbes. Firstly, they're aerobic organisms like us. Generally speaking, we go with aerobic. That means it's air-driven. So just like us, we are aerobic organisms. Some are more aerobic than others. But what we're doing is we're using that air, and that allows us to breathe. And most of your microbes are the same. And they need moisture, water, just like us. We need food, water, and air. The great triangle of needs starts with air, water, and food. And it's the same with our microbes. So the thing that unravels most composting is that people forget that those microbes need to be kept alive, which means that's why you hear about people turning the heaps, getting the air in, because those microbes that are feeding on all of those wonderful organic additives are going to use up the moisture and the air reserves, just as we would. And therefore, if you don't keep replenishing the air and the water, they're going to die very quickly. So composting, very, very important that to keep it working well, remember that it starts to unravel. And you then become the latest cockroach convention or mice and rats in there because it's no longer working. It is just a cold suite of food for the cockroaches and the mice, etc. So if it's working well, it's so hot, up to 60, 65 degrees, you can't have vermin living in there. It's just too hot. Good composting, you can put your arm in there and it's really quite hot, because that's the trillions of those microbes that are feeding on that amazing supply that you've put in. So to keep it working as a heap, you need to turn it regularly. You can use composting screws that will go in and they get air in there. You can use a pitchfork, a shovel. If you've got big composting, people use these massive machines, but the key is you're turning it to get the air into there, and you keep it the consistency and the moisture levels of a squeezed out sponge. If it's too dry, they die first. If it's too wet, you drown the buggers. So the important thing is that you keep managing it, just like if you were brewing beer or baking cakes or bread or something like that. You need to manage that process to make sure that it continues to deliver what you want. And once you've made that beautiful, wonderful compost, then you have to make sure that you use it as a soil improver. It's not a mulch, particularly over summer. The thing I didn't say about living in Perth is that we have such hot, dry conditions, and we also have the ozone hole. Now, why does that fall into the mix? Well, the ozone hole is letting in UV, higher rates of UV. That's why we have some of the highest skin cancer rates in the world. UV, ultraviolet light, is a biological sterilant. In other words, it will kill all biological life. Us, eventually, microbes pretty quickly. So if you put something like manure or compost that's full of microbes and biological life on the soil surface in summer, you're going to cook, kill, fry, and destroy that beautiful product teeming with biological life. And worse still, once it dies, as it breaks down, it's just creating wax on the soil surface. So you've not only wasted that beautiful product, but then it compounds the problems of water repellency. Again, we need to think like gardeners that would be in Yemen or Morocco or Turkey or one of those other really hot, dry parts of the world. And I'm talking about that period from December to early April. At any other time of the year, like now, anything will grow. It's easy, and that's fine. If you only want to have a garden that works for 6 months of the year, then ignore everything I'm saying. But if you want your garden to do well, despite the vagaries of the climate and conditions we have, then you've got to think from the lowest, the worst conditions. So that's why our compost, over the summer, you put it into the soil. At this time of the year, yes, it's gentler, the UV, the sun is nowhere near as harsh and stinging, the temperature's lower, so you can get away with using it as a soil improver on the soil surface, but only over these winter and spring months. Very, very important stuff. And if you use it and you create it, it becomes one of the most precious things. And it is the same with worm juice and compost tea. All of them are derivatives from the breakdown of that organic material. It's amazing stuff to be able to do. Okay, so we're putting all the pieces together for a climate-wise landscape, which is going to be water-wise, fertilizer-wise, and soon we'll talk about fire-wise. So let's talk about mulch. Mulch is one of the most precious things that we have to put onto our landscapes. It is the sunscreen, the sun hat for your landscape. And just as hopefully you're smart enough to know that in Perth in summer you put a good sun hat on, the important thing to remember is our gardens are exactly the same. I always use the analogy, if you were going to the beach on a really hot day and you've forgotten your shoes, you'd know with searing agony how hot those soils can get. Well, imagine being a microbe living in that soil, or imagine being the fine feeder roots trying to live in that soil that is bare. Again, if you look at those hot, dry parts of the world, they don't leave the soil bare. They have living mulches, ground covers, and or the different types of mulches. So that's what I'm going to show you fairly soon. We're going to cut to having a look at some of these mulches in a moment, and just explain some of the good ones and some of the bad ones. And I'll just clear a path here and put my different mulches on. This is what happens when blokes do cooking shows. It's always going to be filthy compared to anyone else. So I've got a few different types of mulches, or let's just say things that are sold as mulch in WA. And I want to explain the difference between them so you can begin to see where they fit into the scheme of things on our landscape. Okay, so these are typically some of the major mulches that you'll see growing or being used. Okay, there they are, and I'll explain them all and how they all fit into the system. Okay, the fundamental thing you need to keep in mind with mulching in Perth is, firstly, it is an incredibly important thing to do. Just as the 11th commandment is, thou shalt use the water and the nutrients where they fall. Again, that's why we talked about the clay and the wetting agents. The 12th commandment is, never leave the soil bare. When we leave the soil bare, the hot, dry winds, the UV, the searing temperatures in summer are going to destroy it. Okay, so if you're using the mulch, so I've had a fantastic question. If you're trying to put the clay dissolved in the watering can, do you peel back the mulch to actually get the clay in? Big fat yes. But what you're trying to do is to just make sure that if this is the soil surface, you just peel back gently so that you're getting down to the first layer. Because if you really scrape and pull that back, what you're doing is interfering with destroying that beautiful interface between your mulch and the microbes in the soil, which are forming these hyphae, these mycelium, which is the network that's allowing your plants to grow. So be very gentle, minimize that soil disturbance, but by all means, carefully peel back, put in your wetting agent and or your clay contacts. All right, so the key principles with mulching in Perth are that your mulch should be rough, coarse, and irregular in shape. Rough, coarse, and irregular in shape. It should hurt your feet if you walked on it with bare feet, because the key is that we want our mulch to act like a membrane that is going to let the water straight through into the soil. There's no point the water from irrigation or rain being held by your beautiful mulch. It has to go into the soil. That's the only way that it can get your plants to grow. You have to be able to get it into the soil. All right, so how do we do that? We use the rough, coarse mulches. So if we have a look at the mulches that we have here, I'll first of all, just to reiterate again, if that's our bare soil, that's fundamentally going to really, we're going to struggle to get our plants to grow. We must put a mulch on there. But a lot of the mulches that are sold or used are over here. So if Woodsy goes to this dark stuff here, So that is typically what's sold in many landscape yards. It looks black, which is fantastic and fine, but the problem with that is it's more like black or brown cotton wool. So when the water hits it, it just gets absorbed by the mulch. It doesn't go into the soil, and therefore you're going to struggle to get your plants to grow. This one on my far right here, your left, is the pea straw or the lupin hay, and that's wonderful stuff for the veggies and the fruit trees. It's high in nutrients and it will break down to add nutrients into the soil, but it does hold water. But because we're growing food plants in that situation, it can make a big difference. So the other types of mulch that we want is either the stone and gravel. So this one here, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we do our Firewise. Stone and gravel. What I love about this stuff, this is recycled construction and demolition waste. How cool is that? So this is stuff that used to just go to landfill. It is now being broken up. You can get lots of different colors, shapes, textures. You can even get it crushed completely fine and use it as a wonderful compacted material for paths or an alternative. And in high fire risk areas, this is a wonderful mulch to use because it's less likely to burn. In fact, it's not going to burn at all. The only thing that might burn is a little bit of those fine fuels in there, but I'll talk more about that in the Firewise section. And then the other thing we're looking for, of course, is this beautiful, coarse, chunky stuff here. So this is your street tree pruning mulch. This has been aged or composted a bit, and this stuff is nice and chunky. You can see it's got lots of gaps in it. So how a mulch works is that the water goes through, so that's good. It's letting it down into the soil. But because it's got all these air spaces in there, in summer, when the insidious impacts of our high evaporation rates wants to suck that water out of the ground and out of your soil, it can't, because there's too many air gaps. It stops that wicking or capillary action. But if we have a look at our dark mulches over here again, that is going to act like a wick. So in summer, it will just keep drawing water out of the soil. So this is probably 2 to 3 times the price of the effective mulches, and it just reduces the effectiveness of your mulching. So why would you use it? It's really important to use the rough, coarse mulches. So there they are in all their glory. So definitely don't have bare soil. Don't use the black mulches. If you have a black mulch and you put it down, just put a good rough, coarse mulch on top of it, and that will start to allow you to break that stuff down and have the results that you want. So good, rough, coarse, chunky mulch. So if we go back to our presentation, so there it is. You want large, irregular shape, coarse and chunky mulch. It's really, really important stuff. So some of my favorites: street tree pruning, pine bark mulch, and here's some of the ideas for the size and the shape. You want it to be about 50 to 75 millimeters thick. That's important because it then acts to shield and protect and insulate that soil. And the really beautiful thing about it is that this is a slow release fertilizer. So if you have a look at the next photo here, so every council does it. You've got all of these trucks going around picking up that green waste, and someone did a chemical assay, which means they took a chemical analysis of that green waste that we throw away. And lo and behold, it had exactly the same configuration of the best general purpose fertilizer. So it had just the right balance of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and all those trace elements, because your plants, that green waste is a manifestation of all those nutrients the plant took out of the ground, which begs the question, why are we getting rid of this stuff? It's not green waste. It's green gold. You should be either, if it's coarse, chunky stuff, getting your own mulcher, which I'll show you some photos of soon, chipping it up and putting it right back under the plant that made it. The greatest compliment you can give your plant is to give it judicious pruning, not wait till you get the green waste notice, which is when most blokes go out and want to do mulching or harvesting and pruning. You prune your plants, gentle pruning, light, regular prunings, chip it up and put it straight back under the plant that made it. That's how it happens in nature. I guarantee if you go down to a beautiful forest in the southwest, you'll never see anyone fertilizing those forests. And yet we feel we have to fertilize our landscapes. The trick is to recycle. As I said before, nature doesn't waste anything. We recycle everything. Those nutrients that fall on the ground, chip them up, make them available for the microbes to break down. So chipping up your plants is like chewing your food. And then, of course, the other thing, all those veggie scraps, etc., you're trying to make sure that you use it. So here are some of the mulching machines that you can get, so you can start to make your own stuff. It's a really powerful way to reuse that material that you're trying to make sure that you use on your landscape. So when you do this, you start to close the cycle and you begin to create the conditions where the amount of nutrients that you need to add diminishes. You can start to save money on your landscaping and gardening. Here's some ways that you can get good quality mulch onto your landscape. So you can get water-wise mulches. There are good, rough, coarse, chunky mulches. Most good landscaping yards will sell it. My favorite is pine bark mulch, but that's expensive, but it's a beautiful mulch. The stone and the gravel, they're recycled. My favorite place to get the recycled mulches is Red Sands. So if you Google Red Sands, they're an amazing company that recycle the construction and demolition waste. So that's bricks and tiles, and it makes an amazing mulch. You can get different colors. And then as we show here, there's MulchNet. So you can actually link in with MulchNet, and they have a network of tree lopping contractors. So if you register as a drop-off point, they will then link you in with a mulching machine or a tree lopper that's trying to get rid of a big lump of mulch, and then you can start to get that delivered to your property. The most important thing when you start to get into mulching is to remember to get yourself a 10-prong pitchfork. There's nothing sadder than people attacking a big pile of mulch with a 3-prong pitchfork, which seems to be designed to neatly distribute from the pile to where you want it to go. Pretty much everything will drop through before it actually gets to the point where you want it to go. So a good 10-prong pitchfork will make a massive difference. You will become a serious gardener on your landscape when you start to do that. Very, very important stuff. So one of the other really important things we need to keep in mind when we're trying to be water wise is to have a look, a good searing look at the way that we fertilize and water. And the way that we water just doesn't make much sense. When you have one of the hottest, driest, windiest parts of the world, why on earth are we having our sprinklers designed like chimney stacks to put the water up into the air where it's got the greatest chance of being dispersed by the wind before it can hit the ground? That's what we do with contaminants. That's why you'll see the big chimney stacks. That's a crazy way to deal with water. So the mantra for water-wise gardening in WA is fat drops of water close to the ground. Fat drops of water close to the ground. And that gives you a profoundly important way to make sure that you can get that water close to the ground. So I'm going to show you some of the really cool ways that we can water our landscapes. Okay, so if you do have lawn, and we're going to talk about verge conversion in a little while, but if you do have garden areas, you can use pop-up sprinklers. But again, the adage, fat drops of water close to the ground, I recommend using MP rotators. So MP rotators, they do fingers of water that basically will go through the air. It's quite mesmerizing to watch them in action, but because it's fatter drops of water and they can direct the water supply, you can reduce your water consumption by about 25%, which is pretty cool. So they're called MP rotators, as it says there. One of the best ways to reduce water consumption is by using drip irrigation. So drip irrigation, and you can see that image there, it's the dark brown. And what we've done is we've just cut the pipe open. So you can see that yellow and black thing in the middle. You wouldn't normally see that. This is, we've dissected the drip irrigation, if you like, and that's the dripper inside. So that's designed to release a set amount of water at each one of those holes. So this is seriously sophisticated irrigation systems. And it's been used in commercial horticulture for many years. It was developed in Israel as a part of the world that knows about semi-arid gardening conditions. So this is how effective it is. Drip irrigation is very, very important stuff. You can find that it is, sorry, I'll just go back a sec. So drip irrigation, can it be anywhere from 80 to 90% efficient? You can see it there. It's laid on the ground. You put the mulch on top, and it allows you to get the water under the mulch straight to where the plants need it. Surface drippers are pretty cool as well. And the micro drippers, again, if it's fat drops close to the ground, that's very efficient. Okay, so I've got a question coming up soon. I'll just finish on the watering, and then we'll go through to a question we have about the clay. And then these are the bad and the ugly. So these are the micro sprays. Again, this is designed to put small drops of water high into the air. So those micro sprays might be 30% efficient. That's insane. Why are we doing it? The soaker hoses are designed to throw water in the air, and they're great for kids' parties, but they're actually no good as watering systems. And the leaky hose, you don't see it much anymore because it doesn't give matched precipitation. It just drops the water randomly, so you don't really get that good, even, consistent watering. Okay, so we have a question. How would you get clay into a no-dig permaculture garden? That's fine. Even a no-dig permaculture garden, you're going to be replenishing every time that you put new plants in, whether it's seed potatoes or seedlings or punnets of plants. And yes, you can dissolve the clay into a watering can. The best way to do that, if you're trying to get as much clay dissolved into the water solution as possible, is get the water to about 40 degrees. So you can put a bit of warm water into there. Again, you're trying to increase the water temperature, so you dissolve it. You can use an agitator, which is what you use for stirring paint. So you just put that on your cordless drill, and you can then be agitating, so you maximize the amount of clay you dissolve into the solution, and therefore you'll get biggest bang for your bucks. All right, let's look at these water-wise plants. We're going to have a break in a little while, but before we do, I'll just talk about these water-wise plants. So to me, we're trying to paint a picture. We're trying to show all the different components that allow you to do well in, as I said, one of the toughest gardening environments in the world. The good news is, if you can create gardens that work here and you're not using massive amounts of water and nutrients, seriously, you could garden anywhere on the planet. You are a gold medal gardener, because this is a tough part of the world to do your thing. So we've talked about improving the soil. We've talked about dealing with water repellency. We've talked about using the right type of mulches and the right type of irrigation. The next thing is your water-wise plants. Now, I'm not talking about your food-growing plants. That's separate, and they're not water-wise. We can make them more water efficient, but by definition, they're not water-wise plants. We love them because they feed us. But if you're thinking that your veggie garden is going to reduce your water consumption, it won't. Interestingly, there's some statistics that show if you grow your own food, you are actually reducing your water footprint, or the amount of water that you consume, by about 20%, because food that is grown at home is actually more effective and efficient, because you're not having massive areas with pivot irrigators where large amounts of water can be lost. So growing food at home is more water-wise than conventional growing, but you're still going to be using a lot of water. By definition, a water-wise plant is a plant that's adapted to these conditions and can survive and thrive on no more than one watering a week. Yep. You're swapping over? Cool. Okay, so we're just doing a gentle swap over. So a water-wise plant is a plant that will grow on 1 or 2 waterings a week. That's it. That's all it needs. A truly tough water-wise plant, 1 watering a week or less. So how do you know what's a water-wise plant? There's some really cool information that's available to you. Number one is you can go to the City of South Perth. They have some fantastic fact sheets on water-wise plants, ones that they recommend, and it's wonderful information. So if you go to the South Perth website and look up water-wise plants, you're going to be able to find lots of information to help you. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Lots has been done to create the conditions where you can get your plants to grow. So that's really, really important. So you can also go to the Water Corporation website. They have a fabulous website with huge amounts of info. Lots of people put huge amounts of info into this to help you come up with a fantastic website that's interactive and a database you can use. So this has got about 1,500 water-wise plants on it, from trees right down to ground covers. And it's got this really cool little section on it. So you just tick the boxes that you want. Do you want a plant with red flowers, to be only growing to this height, to grow in sandy soil? Well, you tick the different boxes. It will then tell you the water-wise plants that actually fit your needs. It's really cool. It's a great free resource. So that's on the Water Corporation website. Lots of tips and lots of little videos, etc., to help you be water-wise. There's plenty out there to help you. Okay, so the important thing that we need to remember is that your landscape should be biologically diverse. And that's what you can start to do when you create a water-wise and fertilized garden. It can start to look really cool and work amazingly well for you. And I always say to people, and I said it one of our first talks here, that a good, well-designed and beautiful and well-maintained garden is going to increase the value of your property. It's going to increase the value. It's absolutely the case. We are awash with banal developments with very ordinary gardens. So if you can have a beautiful garden, a house that's framed by a glorious mix of trees and shrubs and ground covers, that is going to increase the value of your property, because there is an increasing and discerning component of the housing market that wants to have a beautiful garden. And if you can make it climate resilient, then that's going to be a showpiece. Just interestingly, there's some great stats that back this up. So the Real Estate Institute of Australia did a study that showed a well-designed street tree, a well-maintained street tree that's advanced and mature can increase the value of your property by about $18,000. There was another study by Access Economics in Sydney that showed that for every increase in canopy cover of the suburb of 10%, that increased the value of the properties by about 7.7%, which translated to $55,000 per property. And you only need to look. The most salubrious, the most highly sought after, and the most expensive bits of real estate in Perth and every capital city in Australia are the leafy green suburbs. We all aspire to live in places like South Perth, Jutland Parade, Nedlands, Claremont, Peppermint Grove. And what do they all have in common? These beautiful, wonderful trees. So there is no doubt that as we increase the canopy cover, we make our climate, we make our suburbs and our houses more resilient against these impacts of climate change. And at the same time, we're going to be increasing the value of your property. So don't let anyone tell you that the best way to capitalize on your piece of land is to knock everything down, put 4 or 5 amorphous apartments with lots of charcoal grey bricks and a few bits of artificial turf. It is just not what's going to be delivering you good, wholesome, nourishing places to live in, and it's definitely not going to increase the value of that property. All right, I'm going to ask you to be bold. I've already said I think you're wonderful change agents. This is what we can be starting to do to make a difference, to be able to transform. And if you have a look at this, there's no better way to reduce the value of your property than to live in a place like that with a few strategic car bodies. You can clearly tell this is not a photo from South Perth. This is what happens when people don't really care about where they live. And the impact is that the landscapes and the community starts to spiral downwards. What I urge you to do is take a big, bold step and start to say, well, I not only want to have a wonderful garden, but I want to have a wonderful verge. So the next step to truly great, resilient communities is that people start to say, how can I improve where I live beyond my boundary? It's one of the fundamental indicators of a strong, resilient community. And we've said this at many of our workshops, that those communities that are coming through COVID the best, the ones that are bouncing back from the impacts of COVID, are the ones where they have strong communities, where they have a real sense of stewardship amongst the populations, where they're looking out for their verges, they're looking out for their public open spaces, they nourish, they nurture their shared spaces. It's one of the key ingredients. So if you want to try and improve where you live, you want to increase your value, and you want to make South Perth and where you live within it a better place to live, you need to start to take ownership of your verge. This is my place before we've done the build that we're doing now. You can see we've created a beautiful verge, and the key is it becomes an extraordinary place for wildlife. It adds value and it makes your landscape unique. And really importantly, this is the most important thing in the context of this talk, it reduces the amount of water and fertilizer that you need to use. So this landscape here, we don't water it and we don't fertilize it, and we certainly don't mow it. So it becomes a landscape that can largely look after itself. And that's a big, big part of the process. And I just want to illustrate that impact of the heat island effect. So this is a really cool process. So I went out with a temperature gun on just a 32-degree day where I used to live in Bicton. So the bitumen was 45 degrees. So already, if you spend most of your time in shoes and socks, if you walked on that barefoot, that would be excruciating. Okay. And the paving, which was light in color, was about 29 degrees. So not too bad. Under the tree, it was 17 degrees, 27 when it was out in the open, and the artificial turf, 41 degrees. So if there's any truth in advertising, the only thing you can say about artificial turf is it's slightly cooler than bitumen. Everything else is just really not telling you the true story. So it's important to remember that the best gardens, the most resilient gardens, are those where you have good shade. And the best shade is going to come from trees and shrubs. You can put a range of different other things like shade sails, even blankets on hot areas on your landscape. But the important thing is shade from trees is going to be the most important thing that you can add. Okay, so if we talk about some of the things that we can put into our landscape, obviously we'd love you to put trees, but it's the right plant in the right place for the right reasons. And a lot of people, when you talk about trees, they assume it's going to have to be a towering thing like this gorgeous mountain ash. This is actually in the Botanic Gardens in Christchurch, and that is a big tree, and it is not going to fit into many landscapes in Perth. I get that, but that doesn't mean you can't have trees. It just means that these are some of the other ones. Okay, so we've had a question about verges and verge treatment guidelines, and someone has said that Joondalup doesn't have a verge policy around native verges. I find that hard to believe. I think pretty much every council now is either actively or tacitly supporting the evolution of that verge space from being grass to water-wise verges. But what I will do is talk about some of the principles. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Joondalup or another council, if they don't have verge treatment guidelines, if you follow what I'm going to talk about soon, you should be okay. They will allow you to do what you're doing. So let's look at some of the things that we can do to design our beautiful garden. And quite simply, you need to think about your plants in terms of how resilient they are to the climate that we have. So our veggie plants, by and large, are not particularly resilient or water-wise. We love them because they grow food for us, but they're not generally going to be tough plants. I'm not talking about herbs like lavender and rosemary. I'm talking about your classic veggie plants. They generally will struggle through the long summers. So I'll give you some of those ideas. So what we talk about is called hydrozoning. So we group our plants according to how much water and nutrients that they need. It's a really, really important part of that process. So if you're thinking about garden design, which I'd love you to do, I would urge you to get a compass and find out where north is. And then from there, you can start to mark, okay, where I know where north is. So for me, that's north over that way. So that means I know that the hot, dry winds are coming from the east. The sun is going to rise in the summertime in the southeast and in the wintertime in the northeast. And it's going to set in the northwest in summer and set in the southwest. Sorry, it's going to set in the northwest in winter, and it's going to set in the southwest in summer. The angle of the sun changes. All of these things are profoundly important if you want to create a beautiful landscape. So I would urge you to get an aerial perspective of your property. Get a Google map or just draw it by hand. But once you get an aerial perspective and you mark on north and where those hot, dry winds are coming from, where the sun's rising and setting at different times of the year, you can make sense of your landscape. And if you're clever with your landscaping, you should be able to slash your power consumption as well by at least 30 to 50%. You should be able to slash your energy consumption by 30 to 50%. Why? Because you're using plants to shade you in summer and to flood your house with winter warmth when you need it. I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So, as I said, we grow plants from all over the world. So these are what we call the 3-drop plants. So these are the ones that need watering at least twice a week, probably 3 times a week when it's really, really tough. So that's things like your hydrangeas, your camellias, a lot of those what I call rather disparagingly wussy plants, and many of your veggie plants. Remember, veggies, we can make them as water-wise as possible, but they are not water-wise plants. I'm not saying don't grow them, but I say grow them understanding the impacts of the summer sun, and therefore design everything to make those conditions good for those food-growing plants. So our 2-drop plants, they need watering, 2 to 3 times a week, generally speaking. So that's things like roses, camellias, that sort of stuff. Lots of plants, even some of the kangaroo paws and things like purple fanfare or scaevolas. And then our super tough plants. So these are the true water-wise plants. So they need watering no more than once a week. And many of them, no more than once a month. A lot of succulents and a lot of beautiful Australian plants, once they're established, you really don't need to water them at all over the summer because they're just adapted to these conditions. I love A lot of the trees we're now putting into gardens now, things like Eucalyptus vitrix, which is the dwarf ghost gum, and the coral gum. Once they're established, you'll never need to water them again. They're so tough because they've come from the arid interior of Australia. So you bring them to South Perth, it's like a Kentucky tour, as I like to say. They're really, really tough and adapted. So we have these gorgeous plants that we can grow that are adapted to these conditions, and they are magnificent. There are so many. And when it does come to the plants that we grow, it's important to remember that if you do a straw poll of why people come as tourists to WA, and again, we're one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. They don't come to see our football teams, no matter how good you think they're playing at the moment. They don't come to see our cities. They certainly don't come to see our banal suburbs. They come to see the amazing plants that we grow. Kings Park is one of the most iconic parts of Western Australia. And why? Because it is teeming with the incredible diversity of plants that we have. So I would say one of the great signatures, one of the greatest ways to stamp yourself as a truly climate resilient and adapted West Australian is to have a beautiful, diverse, water-wise native garden. Nothing speaks more about your ability to be aligned with and understanding and connecting to where we live than putting in these beautiful water-wise native gardens. And then, as we said, our fertilizers, as we said before, we can do lots to make them grow more effectively for us. And these are some of the examples of verges. We've done lots of them. This is a company I do a lot of landscaping with, Sustainable Outdoors. But the principles of the verge makeovers are such. These are really important things to consider. Number one, all the plants that you use need to be able to be, they're species that you choose or varieties that you choose that don't grow any more than 70 centimeters high. So you're trying to get plants that grow no higher than 70 centimeters. Why? Because you need to protect the line of sight. So that's a fancy way of saying you can see cars and cars can see you. It's a really, really powerful part of what allows your landscape to work for you. And so this is the same in Joondalup. Again, that question, are we going to be able to do this in places like Joondalup? Again, I would look, and Joondalup has some fantastic environmental officers, and you can ask them. So if you ring up the Joondalup Council, if that person is still listening, and ask to speak to the environmental officer, and I'm pretty sure they will tell you that there are verge treatment guidelines, but they're pretty much the same wherever you go in all the councils. The other thing to keep in mind is if you don't have the footpath on your side of the road. So have a look at your verge, and remember your verge technically is from the letterbox to the curbing. That's your verge. Everything from the letterbox to the house is your private land. So the letterbox is always on your boundary. So I love you to adopt the verge and look after it and nourish it, but you need to remember you'll never own that verge. It is an easement, which means it's designed to potentially have services on it like power poles, water meters, gas mains. So sometimes it will be dug up by utility service people, and that can break your heart and drive you mad. But you just need to accept that no matter how good your verge is and how you look after it, it is still not your land. And you just need to accept that sometimes there might be some damage to it. Okay, so if your verge and you don't have the footpath on your side, you need to leave the first meter or to meter and a half. Just check with your local guidelines. You need to leave that first meter trafficable. That's really, really important. You need to make sure that you've designed that so that people can walk along that. So you can't have rubble mulches, you can't have plants that are anything more than ground covers, and you can have mulch. But it needs to be someone can jump off the road and walk along there. If you have the footpath, then that's fine. You can just go from the footpath to your letterbox with those plants that are 70 centimeters high. If there's no footpath, it's basically that first meter is trafficable, and then you can have plants to 70 centimeters high. So here are some examples of mulch, of landscapes that have been done. And what I love about these gardens is we can think about our gardens in terms of diversity of plants. It's really, really important. So you can see the different colors, the different schemes going through. We used to say plants are green. Well, that's a little bit like the Eskimos knowing that they have all these different colors for what we call white. As a landscaper, to me, plants aren't green. There's so many different hues and colors and textures. So a really beautiful landscape is a diversity of colors, shapes, textures, and that's even before you start to talk about the flowering of our plants. So we have some absolutely beautiful plants that we can put in here. So if we have a look at these 3 designs that we have here, that grey that you can see through the middle, that's Eremophila cowberry carpet, an absolutely glorious ground cover. And you can see it juxtaposes with the others. You can see that photo on the right-hand side, that emerald bright green, which contrasts again with that grey. That's called Myoporum, and that's a beautiful iridescent green, which contrasts so well against those other colours. There are plants that have a burgundy coloured leaf, the different flowering, all of that sort of stuff can make a massive difference to show your landscape off. And integrating in things like, so you can see this verge on the top left, they've integrated in some paving, because a lot of times people say, well, I use the verge for parking the car or the boat. That's fine. You can still integrate that in and have a beautiful verge that's been made over. You can see all these wonderful designs, pathways, many different things you can create, these gorgeous landscapes. And I always add in features like rocks, bird baths, gabion baskets. You can start to create these exquisite landscapes that look so cool. Here's some verges closer to where I live. You can see a range and beautiful diversity of plants. So there's the footpath on this side. So all those plants that have been chosen will only grow to 70 centimetres high. I'm not talking about the street trees. You can grow street trees, but they will be under pruned. So again, you can see cars and they can see you. It's a really important part of that process. There's that beautiful garden from another angle, diverse, so many beautiful plants. And one of my favorite plants in that mix, it's in the foreground there, is the Eremophila. And this is one of the Eremophilas. This is called Eremophila Pink Passion, and it's got these beautiful pink flowers. The Eremophila as a group of plants, Eremophila, that's the genus or its scientific name. The Eremophilas, that stands for, or it's Greek for lover of lonely places. How cool is that? How whimsical is that? And what it means is that they actually naturally grow in the really harsh desert and semi-arid conditions of Australia. So again, you bring them to Perth, they're super tough. They grow so, so well. Here's some other things that people have done on their verges. There's lots of different ways that you can integrate in plants into your landscape and to even get things to grow. So there's some food growing. You can see on some of these different types of landscapes. Again, because the footpath is there, it's much less of a hazard for people, but you can integrate beautiful plants into that space. Taking ownership of the verge, I say, is one of the greatest indicators of a thriving, healthy community where people are living. And look at this here. You can see the beautiful street trees. So people are guerrilla planting. I love this. To me, it's one of the great indicators of a resilient community. People start to look for areas where they can put in more trees. And if we accept that we're losing a lot of trees in our urban spaces through infill development and people like Main Roads who see it as their mission in life to clear as many trees as possible, we need to be balancing that by trying to put trees in. And again, the take-home message, the maxim, the get-out-of-jail card is you put the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. You think about your plants. Here, where there is no overhead power lines, they've been able to put a range of different trees in, which are going to fit within that space. And it's perfectly acceptable to do that. And you should always look to ask your City of South Perth whether you can be registered as a space to get a free street tree. I think the free street tree scheme is fantastic because firstly, the council pays for the tree, they put it in and they manage it, and you get the benefits because, as I said, that can increase the value of your property by up to $18,000. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to put those plants in. It doesn't have to be big. You can have small little pockets where you can put those plants. But again, taking ownership of that verge is such a powerful way to make a difference. And here are some other great examples of verge treatments. Again, you don't have to have a lot of space, but you can make a big difference. So my apologies there. It says follow the City of Bayswater guidelines. Just say follow the City of South Perth guidelines. The important thing is there are some amazing things that you can do. So if you're going to adopt your verge, and I passionately hope you do, these are some of the principles. Again, Think design. You put the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. Remember, you need to make sure none of these plants grow above 70 centimeters high. That's their top height. And there are so many plants that fit that mold. And again, the City of South Perth guidelines will give you some great ideas. You need to control the weeds before you start. We're doing an installation of a demonstration verge for Bayswater at Riverside Gardens this Saturday. And I was out there today supervising getting rid of the weeds. So it was a beautiful area of grass, which is fine if you're kicking a football or having a picnic, but it's an absolute disaster if you're trying to grow your beautiful waterwise gardens, because those grasses, couch and kikuyu, are two of the worst weeds in the world as well. So we had a bobcat out scalping away, getting rid of that top section with the grass and the roots, so that we can now have a fresh soil that we can put in our clay and our compost and create the conditions to get those plants to grow. And very importantly, going back to that question that someone asked about the calendar, you're looking to plant your plants in early winter. So for us, that means we get the soil improved and we put our plants in at this time of the year. So that's really, really important. We're trying to put those plants in so that they get to take advantage of the full conditions of full conditions of winter before the blast furnace of summer. I often say that if your plants could talk, they would tell you that they hate summer. They hate it. Imagine being a plant living in Perth over summer. We get to escape indoors. These poor buggers are out there being crucified by the sun. So whatever you can do to put them in at the right time of the year, so that if you can put them in now, we've had enough breaking rain that they should be fine. That means they get May, June, July, August, September, October, 6 months to get themselves ready for the blast furnace of summer. The worst thing you can do is to get plants in September or October, don't do anything to improve the soil, stick them in, and we wonder why they don't do well. You have to think. Again, these are some of the toughest gardening environments on the planet. So we need to be thinking whatever we can do to improve that soil is profoundly important. So that's why we say, put them in at the right time of the year, improve that soil, mulch your plantings. And this last bit that says, the fertilizer, the best fertilizer for your plants is your shadow. And I'll explain that. Particularly when you're trying to grow food plants, it's really, really important to remember that when you're trying to grow food plants or any plants, you need to be keeping an eye on them. So that means you go out and have a look at them. So your shadow is there. You're checking, is the water going into the soil or is it water repellent? Have you got weeds encroaching? Is the plant being smothered? Is the plant getting too much shade? Is it being hammered by pest and disease? You're only going to know, and you're only going to be able to intervene if you're over looking at your plants. So try and make a commitment to make the fertilizer is your shadow. You're going out there and having a look, and that is the greatest way to make sure your plants grow well. We did some workshops early in COVID where we were, and the headline was turning punnets of seedlings into plants of promise. So it's one thing to buy a punnet of seedlings thinking you'll grow food, and that's a great first step. But there's a world of difference between to have a punnet and also being able to get those plants to grow. So we're going to have a 20-minute break. So what we'd ask you to do is to go and check that your soil is not water repellent. Take the headphone out, the head torch out and have a look. No, actually go and grab a cuppa, toilet break, whatever it takes. And the poll. Yes, so we've got a fabulous poll that we'd love you to do. So this poll is really, really important to help us. Again, remember that these workshops have been funded by the City of South Perth. And so this is really important feedback. And if you don't use it, you lose it. So if we get good results back, if people are enjoying these events, so please do the poll. It makes a big difference for us. Yep, it's just gone out now. So that will allow you to have a look at that. Please do that. And when you're getting yourself a cuppa. So we'll come back at 10 to 8. And when we come back, we'll be launching into, we're going to show you some beautiful trees, some of the species and different things that you can use. And I'll also do a little bit on growing food, some of the techniques and strategies to have really good, strong, vigorous growth of your food plants. And then we'll talk a bit about firewires as well. So have a wonderful break, and we'll see you back here at 10 to 8 or 7:50. All right, we're back, you legends. I hope you've had a nice replenishing break. You got your synapses firing. You're ready for the next section. Um, Again, climate resilience and everything we're talking about is about, I believe, allowing you to have the most extraordinary experience living here. My favorite maxim when I'm talking about living sustainably and living well in Perth is make your garden the biggest room of your home. Make your garden the biggest room of your home. So it's railing against this idea of building these enormous cheek to jowl homes where the garden is nothing more than a tacked on afterthought. Nothing, to me, is going to drive a wedge between your health and the sanity and the connections that you have with you, your family, and nature better than these great big McMansions, trophy houses where there is nothing left of that garden. But building it so the garden is the biggest room of your home is actually an extraordinarily powerful way to create that resilience. And of course, when you have a smaller home and a bigger garden, you've got room for trees. So let's have a look at these beautiful trees and some of these things that we can put into our landscapes. We're so lucky to have these amazing landscapes, and our climate is extraordinary. And even though we are a semi-arid climate, we can grow beautiful plants here and even some of our deciduous trees. So two of my favorite deciduous trees on your screen at the moment. We've got a beautiful pistachio. Look at that gorgeous red. And then on the yellow, on the right-hand side is the honey locust, otherwise known as the gladitia. So they're the trees, the deciduous trees that you would put in that arc, remembering that compass between the northeast and the northwest, a really powerful part of that process. And what we're looking for in South Perth is what we call low chill varieties. So a low chill variety means that these are adapted to what is a pretty moderate climate. So by that, I mean, it doesn't get very cold here in Perth, even though you might whinge about how cold it is. Woodsy was just complaining to me when we were off air about how cold it is. I tell him to harden up and remember that he's not living in Wandering or Bridgetown, otherwise known as Fridgetown, and that's really cold for Perth. So chilling hours, that's below 7.2 degrees. That is what your plants, your deciduous plants, need to determine when they lose their leaves and when they start to get sap flow and bud burst. In Perth, we have about 200 to 220 hours on average per year below 7.2 degrees. Not a lot. And so there's not many deciduous plants that can do well in those conditions. I always say the reason why you don't have cherry trees growing in Perth, the most beautiful tree in the world, who doesn't love cherries when they're flowering? It's because it's just not cold enough. They're not adapted to these low chill environments. So for Perth, when you put your deciduous trees in, go for it. Put them between the northeast and the northwest arc of your home, but they must be low chill varieties. So I passionately recommend going to really good nurseries. My favorites, L&B Tree Farm, magnificent nursery that does advanced trees. They've got a wonderful website, L&B Tree Farm. Dawson's, I love Dawson's for many reasons. Firstly, because they have awesome staff who are really well trained. So you can go in with pest and disease problems. You can go in and say, here's a photo of a plant that I like, or this is my garden, what plant will grow well there? So you can get some really good advice to get things to grow. In my part of the world, Dawson's in O'Connor. Poor old Derek, who's the manager there, is an absolute doyen, and I drive people towards him all the time. I'm amazed he hasn't tried to smother me in my sleep by now, because I just say he's such an amazing guy and he's got so much knowledge. You want to be able to go to people that know what they're talking about. And that's why those nurseries, Dawson's, L&B, incredible. Okay, so there are some beautiful plants, and look at some of these verge plants that we can put in. How extraordinary are these as an alternative to lawn? I love lawn. I don't have a problem with lawn, but remembering that maxim, you put the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. Why put lawn on the verge? If you could ever remember a time when someone was kicking football or reading the newspaper or having a picnic on the lawn, when have you ever seen anyone use lawn for that on the verge? It's just because we conventionally did that we believe that's why we have to do it. And if you want to make a massive saving, think about the verge lawn. The verge lawn might use 50 to 70,000 litres of water per year. And for what? I'm not saying for a moment put in artificial turf. I'm saying put in these beautiful alternatives. So look at these gorgeous plants here. We've got Grevillea bedspread. That's the top left-hand side. Goodenia, which is this beautiful yellow flowers. Then the lamandras. I love lamandras. I use them all the time in landscaping. My I love putting the lamandra, so that beautiful lime tussocky kind of look to them. They look amazing next to limestone rocks or corten steel. Beautiful plants. They contrast so well. So great plants. Then there's the correas. Beautiful. I love correas. They're called the native fuchsia, and they are amazing. And many of them grow really well in shaded environments. So that's really handy if you're trying to grow plants in all different places. Here's some amazing designs. This is again from the Water Corporation. So much of the work's been done for you, so it's pretty easy to get access. And again, City of South Perth, lots of great information on their website as well. So it allows you to be able to really get the best out of these situations. So some fantastic designs, species associated with it. Again, putting the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. Look at these different types of designs that are there for you. It's all free. You can take advantage of it. It's got the species, and these are all tough water-wise plants that will add value. And whatever the theme is that you're looking for, you can get plants that will work. This is a Mediterranean, so this is probably more a mix of perhaps some of our native plants, but things like echiums and maybe salvias and a different range of plants like that, maybe some succulents, all of which will give you that beautiful idea of a tough water-wise garden, but perhaps with a broader suite. A cottage garden, again, that'll have more things like echiums again and salvias, but you'll probably have a range of things like rosemary and lavender in there as well. Lots of beautiful plants. And what I love about what's happening with Australian plants is that nurserymen and women are starting to take these beautiful Australian plants and tweak them and hone them and breed them like we've done with every other plant that we love. So if you think about a rose, that's been cultivated for maybe 1,000 years. There are hundreds of varieties. The wild rose is virtually seen by no one. So that's what we do. If we like plants, we let them in the room, as it were, and we hone them and tweak them. Every single fruit or vegetable that you consume has been tweaked and honed by humans for, again, sometimes thousands of years. I always love the story of potatoes. They were originally extraordinarily toxic. You couldn't eat them. It was only through breeding and breeding and breeding that we got them to the point where we got them where we can now eat them. So it's just a normal thing that starts to happen, and it's happening more and more with our Australian plants. So you're finding even with a Mediterranean or a cottage style garden, you're getting more and more of those beautiful Australian plants, and they will bring your garden alive. This is a coastal garden theme as well. Again, the right plants in the right place for the right reasons. These are some of the garden designs that we've come up with. This is a bit more of a funky kind of postmodern look, depending on what you're after. This is more angular. Again, gardens should fit the design and your aesthetic, and you can do anything in these situations. Again, soil improving, right types of mulches, so they're rough, coarse, and irregular in shape. And one of my favorite things to do with landscaping is to remember that landscaping is not just the plants, and it's not just the flowers. So again, I love that many of the plants we use, the flowering is just the icing on the cake. The texture and the color and the shapes and the variation is such a part of that palette. But remember as well that your landscape is the different types of mulches that you use. They add color. Varying the topographics. There's nothing boring. There's nothing more boring than just a flat landscape. So create dunes and swales. Again, that garden that we're designing, that we're putting in on Saturday. And if you want to come to that, just check out the City of Bayswater website or the Forever Project website. So this Saturday morning, we're literally live installing a beautiful native garden. And today I was directing the Bobcat driver to put these beautiful dunes and swales. So we'll plant it. It'll have gorgeous variation. And if you think about the Perth landscape before we cleared it and put banal subdivisions on it, that's what it had, these beautiful gentle swales called aeolian dunes. That's part of the character of the Perth Swan Coastal Plain. So you can mimic that in your designs. And if you're struggling because there might be a shallow area, there's roots, or it's rocky, or you just can't get plants to grow, cool. Put a bird bath, put a gabion basket, put some metal sculptures, put some big rocks. Landscaping is much more than just the plants. It's all these other things that you can put into the mix. And I love that the best gardens are that beautiful synergistic impact of the plants and what we call the hard landscaping components, which are, as I said, rocks, sculptures, beautiful winding paths. That's the hard landscaping. And then the green or the soft landscaping is your plants. And it's the balance between the two that creates extraordinary landscapes. So you should have as your aim, I believe, to make the garden the biggest room of your home, and also have the aim that you want to create that wow factor. So when people get out of the car, off the bike, dismount from the horse in South Perth and come to your place, they go, wow, how amazing is your landscape? And if you can elicit the wow, guess what? It's going to be a landscape that is worth more. It will add to the real estate value. So far from believing that we need to sacrifice nature to capitalize on the financial value of a piece of real estate, all evidence is to the contrary. Don't believe it. You have to recognize that beautiful landscapes that are nurtured and nourished can be an extraordinary part of what makes your home a beautiful place to live, to nourish you, the kids, the grandkids, the lover, all those other things. But it's also an amazing place to capitalize on that value that you have. Okay, so there's lots of different types. We do nature play designs. If you want a nature play garden, so to get the kids outdoors, you might integrate more logs and rocks and water features. Kids love playing with water, and all the research is coming out now, which is saying that we need to design our landscapes to get kids outdoors. One of my favorite stories recently is that a friend of mine, she's doing postdoctoral studies on the links between early childhood development and their links to greenery. And she's working at the Telethon Institute. And what she's showing is that there's a frightening correlation between kids' access to nature, or how little access they get to nature, and how it impairs, how it retards their cognitive, their physiological, and their physical development. In other words, kids that are disconnected from nature are deprived. We need to design our gardens. We need to design our play spaces. We need to design our verges, our public open spaces, to encourage kids to get outdoors, away from screens, so they can begin to develop what they need, which is that resilience. And that resilience only comes from when they spend time in what's called wild nature. And one of my favorite stories is in Finland. You know, we all have the food triangle. So the health department put forward the food triangle. So we're meant to eat most of the stuff that's down the bottom and smaller amounts of the bits up the top. Well, they use that principle and they call it the nature paradigm. So for them, and this is part of their recommendations, this is endorsed by the Finnish government, and it's put out there to help people understand how they can be mentally and physically healthy. So their nature paradigms or recommendations is you spend a certain amount of time in gardens, you spend a smaller amount of time in parks, you spend a smaller amount of time in the local reserves, and then you must still spend a small amount of time, but in wild nature, getting kids out climbing trees, stepping over rocks, over streams, all those things that test a kid and develop their resilience. And that is critical to our kids' development. So please, whatever it takes to get you putting in beautiful gardens that have some elements of wildness, you're doing it for your kids, the grandkids, the nephews, any kids that you really care about. It's one of the most important things that we can do. So that's a nature play garden in all its glory. This one's called the Dunes. So this mimics more of a coastal theme. So you might have deeper, more accents between the dunes and the swales. Beautiful stuff. And then this one is called the Reserve. Again, there's no limit to the imagination. And I would passionately urge you, have a look at some of the good landscape designs that are out there and look at some beautiful websites. And why would you not want this in your garden? Look at that extraordinary diversity. And again, these are seen as some of the most exquisite gardens you'll find anywhere on the planet. You can see that nice combination there. And these are some of the landscape design programs that we've run in partnership with the Water Corporation, putting in these gardens on people's verges. But if you're going to maintain your garden, well, actually, if you want to have a beautiful garden, you have to maintain it. It's that simple. There is no such thing as a maintenance-free garden. Even artificial turf starts to have weeds growing through it, and dogs wee on it and poo on it, and nothing breaks down, so you have to start spraying it with bleach. It just becomes bizarre, but it still needs management. So having a look at any of your garden, I always love using the analogy, if you go to Kings Park, which is a beautiful place to go, all the gardens that you look at are managed. They have a horticultural team in excess of 60 people, and their job is to go around managing these beautiful gardens. It's not an accident that they look wonderful, because they have an army, a team of people looking after it. So a beautiful garden is one that's maintained. So what you need to be doing, these are, I believe, the fundamental principles to get those plants to grow. So maintain your mulch. So if you're putting that beautiful street tree pruning or pine bark mulch on your garden, it is going to break down and add nutrients to the soil. So you need to replace it. You're probably looking at replacing your mulch at least once a year. Apply the wetting agents. If you have lawn and veggie gardens, you should be putting that wetting agent on 3 times a year. So for high performance areas like lawn and your veggie gardens, put the wetting agents on now, again, so we're getting the most of those beautiful precious rains, probably again in around October, November, as I said, when we're starting to make the transition from rain to irrigation. And again, because a wetting agent only lasts about 2 months, probably around Christmas time. If you use, and I'll talk a little bit more about this with the veggie garden soon, but I would use an organic wetting agent for my food growing areas. Don't promote unnecessary growth. So in other words, limit the amount of fertilizer. If you've been adding the clay and the compost, you shouldn't need to do large amounts of fertilizing, because whatever you've added in the past is going to stay there around your roots. Control your weeds. Oh my goodness. If you want plants to grow, you need to remember that the lawns that we've deliberately introduced into most gardens in Perth just happen to be 2 of the worst weeds on the planet. I'm talking about cooch and kikuyu. They are magnificent play surfaces. It always amazes me. A game of football finishes, you've had 36 dudes, all women, running around, scratching and tearing the hell out of that lawn. Within 2 weeks, 2 weeks, it's healed. It is a miracle plant. And the reason how it can heal and it's so tough and resilient is it has those underground rhizomes. That's cooch and kikuyu, which means it's so much harder to control. If you're putting a new lawn, I'd passionately recommend something like Sir Walter Buffalo. So that's a soft leaf buffalo, because it doesn't have the underground rhizome. So it's much easier to control. But cooch and kikuyu, if you've done any weeding, you'll know that's the stuff that is resilient, and you'll struggle to keep that under control. Some tips to control weeds, particularly if you're putting in new plants now and you've got those big aggressive areas of cooch and kikuyu, is that if you're going to be using herbicide, you need to remember that herbicide is a poison. It will have a deleterious effect on the environment. Glyphosate is the most common herbicide that's used, and that's called a knockdown herbicide, which means it kills everything it comes into contact with, and it will have a deleterious effect on the microbes in your soil. So if you're going to use it, think of it as a very powerful weapon, which can have massive negative implications if it's not used carefully. So if you're going to use herbicide, this is my strategy that I passionately believe you should use to get the best results. Number 1, remembering what we said about the fertilizers and how lush growth is weak growth. Okay, so if you want to kill your grass or what the weeds are, getting ready for your preferred system of plants, 2 weeks before you want to kill that plant, give it a dose of urea. It's the only time I recommend fast-acting nitrogen. So what nitrogen is, all plants are nitrogen junkies. They love it. So when you give them urea, they grow very quick with fast, green, fresh, tender growth. So it means it has thin cell walls, so it has very few defenses against the herbicide. This is a technique that all good spraying contractors use. They use less herbicide and they put more of the urea in, and they make sure the plants are young and or actively growing. And that way you can get a fantastic kill. It's so cool. So you use less herbicide, you get a better result, and then you replace it with your preferred plants. So 2 weeks before, give it a nice liquid spread of nitrogen fertilizer. It'll be young and actively growing. Then when you make up your spray mix, put in some wetting agent and even a bit more urea, and you'll get a much better result. And never use more than the 2% solution. That's the maximum they recommend. So that way you can use a herbicide, you're using it responsibly, and you'll be able to get a good result, so you can replace it with your preferred plants. If you're using organic strategies, there are now organic herbicides that you can get. Famously, there's one called Eco Slasher, there's one called Beta Weed. They're again available through Dawson's and Bunnings. If you're going to use those, the plant, it needs to be a hot, still day, so you desiccate the plant. But cooch and kikuyu, because they've got that rhizome, which is like a bulb in an onion or a potato or Guildford grass or Watsonia, that bulb allows the plant to regrow. So if you're using those herbicides, the organic herbicides, you need to remember that it's going to take a while to really kill the Cooch and Kaiku. It's just going to keep trying to come back and cause you problems. So if you are looking at putting your plants in, the biggest problem that you have is the resurgence of weeds, and the worst of the weeds is the Cooch and Kaiku. So you're just going to need to keep a handle on that. Another strategy for really good organic control, particularly if it's done in summer, is to get good black plastic. UV stabilized pond liner is great. Where you want to kill the Cooch and Kaiku, put fish and seaweed solution, so you're getting it nice and you're building up the microbial activity. Then you put the black UV stabilized pond liner on top, weigh it down, and that will get really hot. It will stimulate the biological activity so it kills and breaks down the thatch in situ. You can scalp it away, as I did today with that Bayswater garden. So you're peeling off that grass. It should leave a relatively fresh landscape for you, and you'll get some sprigs of Cooch and Kaiku, so you still will need to manage. Okay, prune excessive growth. Of course, your plants are going to grow and you can prune that excess growth, but mulch it wherever you can. Chip it up, put it back into your garden. Remember, green waste is actually green gold. Go and raid the neighbour's pile out the front that they're looking to put into the green waste collection, because if you chip it up or compost it, you're putting those nutrients back into your landscape, and that's a win. Check your irrigation system regularly. Sadly, most irrigation comes on early, which is good from a water management perspective, but we then don't see whether it's working well. And you can find that your irrigation is not working, and you'll know because plants aren't doing well. And it could be as simple as there's some blades of grass in front of the sprayer, so it's just stopping it from growing properly. So check your irrigation regularly and make seasonal adjustments to how much water you use. The Water Corporation had to ban winter sprinkling because people weren't turning off their sprinklers. Again, we're the fastest growing part of the world's driest community. It makes no sense that we were watering in the middle of winter when there was no one needing that water. And remember, if you put too much water onto a garden, you just flush nutrients away. So it does not pay to water more than is needed. So there are lots of different ways that you can make a difference and a change. These are some of the verge treatments that we've done, where we've done events where people can come along and literally see the installation of a garden. And as I said, we're doing one this Saturday with the City of Bayswater down at Riverside Gardens from 9 till 12. Come down and have a look and you'll be able to see what can happen. All right, that's working not so well. It's interesting. That's not work. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit on Firewise now, which is an important part of this process. Now, you may not think that South Perth has an issue with fire, but believe it or not, it actually does. And one of the things we need to remember is that South Perth, like all of the councils in WA, takes the risk of fire very seriously. We live in a part of the world that can have some of the most catastrophic fires that you find anywhere in the world. We have the potential for massive, massive fires. So even in somewhere where South Perth, the fire risk is there. So we have two important agencies that are working in partnership with the City of South Perth to manage that risk. And what they're trying to do is to assess the risk and then come up with a management strategy that is then endorsed. So City of South Perth has gone through that process, and that plan has taken 2 years. It's just about to be signed off. So what happens is there's DFES, which is the Department of Fire and Emergency Services. That's the state government. And then within that is OBRM, which is the Office of Bushfire Risk Management. So their job is to work with local governments like South Perth, and they say to South Perth, we need you to assess the fire risk across your region. And that's what South Perth has done. They're one of the first to have their report, which is about to be signed off by OBRM, again, Office of Bushfire Risk Management. So what that means is they've looked at all those high fire risk areas, which is generally some of your beautiful nature reserves, and it's looking at the strategies that the City of South Perth is recommending for management of that. And then they will look at that in relation to the urban, the industrial, and the commercial aspects of South Perth. Remember, thousands of people live in the City of South Perth. So the city has a responsibility to manage those risks. And that's exactly what they've been doing. So what I'm going to show you now is some of those things. So if you want to know more about the bushfire hazard reduction risk management strategy that's been done by the City of South Perth, you just need to go onto the website at City of South Perth and have a look at their bushfire risk management plan. And that will give you what's being endorsed and the strategies. But the stuff that I'm going to be talking about now is recommended by Obram and the City of South Perth as their way of managing that risk. Obram and DFES and the City of South Perth recognise that we have a responsibility to reduce fire risks, yes, but we also have a responsibility to manage those ecologically important areas. And part of that is the fuel loads that are in there. So I've been talking about mulch and the rain of leaf litter, which is very important for composting and turning back into the soil. But it's also a fuel load. And that's what we're going to talk about now, is just some of those ways that we can make a difference to actually show that and how we can make a difference to reduce that risk. So the important thing to keep in mind is, and we're just opening this up now, this is one of the slides that we show. And often it's about making those connections between fuel loads. So for us, the risk, and if you are living near one of those beautiful nature reserves in South Perth, there is a risk of fire. Generally speaking, if there's fire, it's arson. As a DFES officer once said to me, the three major causes of fire in Perth are man, woman, and child. So fundamentally, if there is going to be a fire, it's generally because someone has deliberately lit a fire. It's out of control at the wrong time of the year. So there is the potential for fire to impact on homes. If you're concerned about that, again, you can talk to the City of South Perth, and that bushfire assessment that has been done will be able to identify where the major risks of fire are. So if you're living near that bush area, these are some of the principles. We call them FireWise principles. And the good news about FireWise principles is there's a very strong overlap between WaterWise and FireWise and even WasteWise. So you can see here's our house, and there are the different zones. Zone 1 is the most intensive management space. So that means we're trying to reduce the risk of what we call ember attack. Now, when we think about fire, when we've seen those catastrophic images, and we've all seen plenty of them where there's the big fires coming, 80% of houses that burn down, it's actually those embers, those sparks that are coming from the fire front. They're the ones that lodge, get into the nooks and crannies and can burn down houses. Particularly too, in urban areas, the major risk is air conditioning. So it's a hot day, fire started, you don't know that your air conditioner is sucking in those embers. And of course, the ducting just takes those embers through the entire house. So when houses have often burnt down in urban settings, it's because the air conditioners are still on and those embers are being drawn, literally sucked into the house. So most importantly, the zone around your house, if the fire risk is high for you, again, you're living near one of those beautiful big reserves. And I heard a couple of days ago that there's going to be a hazard reduction burn done at Kings Park this year. So that's going to be a really interesting example of how they balance smoke and people living in an urbanized area, but reducing the impacts on wildlife and fuel loss or habitat, but as well reducing those fuel loads, because Kings Park is a major area of bushland and therefore there is the risk of fire. Okay, so zone 1 around the house, if the fire risk is high for you, we'll show you some examples of FireWise gardens. But fundamentally, one of the big things that we recommend is you change the types of mulches that you use. You use more stone and gravel, you have a lot more paths, and you choose FireWise plants. And we're going to show you a video about that towards the end, which will give you some good ideas. Further out we go, zone 2 and zone 3 is where we start to do fuel load management. Now, living in South Perth, that generally means that zone 2 and zone 3 are managed by the City of South Perth. So some of the key things that the City of South Perth will be doing is reducing those fuel loads, but maintaining the ecological integrity of those spaces. And that's what I'm going to show you in a minute, is some of those very important parts of that process. So again, zone 3, they're reducing those fuel loads. They're trying to keep a handle on that. Zone 2, they're probably integrating in more fire retardant plants. And zone 1 is the area where we do lots of changes. And there we go. That's fuel load. Yes, it's mulch, and yes, it's breaking down and returning nutrients to the soil. But from a fire perspective, That represents about 30 tonnes per hectare of fuel. That's catastrophic fuel loads. And so we need to manage those, particularly when there is housing nearby. So here's some of the examples of how fuel loads are reduced and managed. So generally speaking, you're going to find in your beautiful bushland reserve. So yeah, this is looking a bit odd on the screen here. There's been some changes that have gone on, changing it from one PowerPoint presentation to another, but I'll talk you through it. So when you're walking through beautiful bushland reserves in South Perth, this gives you a bit of a background as to how they're managing things. Firstly, they'll put the dual purpose tracks. So they're designed so you can walk down there with hubby and the dog, perhaps on a lead, but they're also designed so emergency vehicles can get through there to either manage arson attacks, get that fire under control quickly, and or allow them to do fuel reduction burns. They will also then, in partnership with the ecologists within the City of South Perth, work out and map where they're going to do burns. So they'll never do big burns. They do what we call compartmentalized burns, which means that they're doing small patches of burning at any time. Because if you burn too much at any one time, firstly, massive amounts of smoke, which really is not going to make anyone very happy. Secondly, it means that you have a huge impact on the wildlife because there's nowhere for them to go. So you're going to destroy their habitat, and it gets rid of their food sources and basically where they basically are going to protect themselves from the impacts of predators. So we only do compartmentalized burning. And here are the principles. So they do mosaic burns, small patchwork burns. And the principles are, you do it in patchworks. Again, my apologies that the words are all over the screen. And you basically do them on a rotation. So by rotation, that means that you do those areas, you burn them every, ideally, somewhere between 5 to 7 years, maybe a little bit more frequently. But you don't want to burn them too often, because if you burn every year, the only plants that can grow and thrive in those conditions are things like veld grass, African love grass, which are massive, massive weed threats and fire risks as well. So these are all the background bits of science that are going into the management of the reserves within the City of South Perth. And they're designed, again, to balance the ecological integrity and the fire risk within those regions. And again, that's all being endorsed by DFES and the Office of Bushfire Risk Management, OBRM, and in partnership with the City of South Perth. So that's been an ongoing process in the background to make sure that you can live in an area that's safe. If you want to look at some of the landscaping ideas that can help you, again, if you're close to and you have a risk of fire, this is a beautiful publication put out by the CFA, which is the Victorian equivalent of Department of Fire and Emergency Services, our DFES. So you can go online to the CFA website. It's a magnificent publication. And this is an example of an urban garden where you've got a nice break. You've got lots of fire retardant plants, good areas of lawn, paving, ponds, and all the trees have been high pruned. And that's a really powerful way to make sure that it can work well for you. And again, this is not working all that well for some reason. Okay, this is a beautiful modern garden, lots of different things. And here are some examples. This is my place, where you can see beautiful crushed recycled paths, lots of firewise plants, all designed, if the risk of fire is high, to make sure that any embers that land are going to find it impossible to burn. And one of our favorite things to use is stone and gravel. As I said, recycled stuff from red sands is an amazing product to use. And that allows you to create beautiful, unique landscapes, but at the same time, reduce that risk of fire. Increasingly, we've been doing firewise demonstration gardens. Here's one that we did with the City of Armidale. And it shows people the various ways that you can have a garden that is beautiful, productive, sustainable, but it's also firewise. So if that is a risk for you, it's going to be a really powerful way that you can make a difference here. And this is an example of a firewise garden that we did. And you can see all the beautiful types of mulches that we used, and that's all the recycled material. So before we leave this here, I was just going to show you a quick firewise video, which I think will make things a little clearer for you. So we're just going to cut to that in a moment. Wherever you are, I'll put you on big. And so this is one that I shot with our wonderful team here that are doing this for you. This is a firewise video, which we did at a Firewise landscape we put in at the Jandakot fire station. It's hard to imagine it today with this drizzle, but within a few short months, this area and many areas like this in Australia are going to be under the risk of catastrophic fire. And firefighting agencies will tell you that many properties are poorly prepared for that. And what we can do is design and install and manage Firewise landscapes. We're at Jandakot today with the recently upgraded fire station, and as part of the installation, we put in this demonstration Firewise garden. Now, for me, a Firewise garden has 4 important principles. Number 1, you use fire retardant plants. Now, these are plants that either don't burn or burn very slowly if they're well managed. Number 2 is you space the plants, so you have gaps between them, because what we're trying to do is reduce the impact of ember attack. So that's those little orange things that we see flying through the air during a catastrophic fire. When they land on vegetation or dry fuels, then they keep burning, and that's when they can take out a house. So if we can space them out, it makes it harder for the embers to build up momentum to take out property. And number 3, all the materials that we use in the gardens have to be non-flammable. And here we've gone for recycled rubble, beautiful stuff that came from the building and construction industry, and we can use different colors, different grades, but all of it again is going to stop embers. And number 4, most importantly, you can have the best design in the world, but you have to manage that landscape. So as fine fuels start to settle on it and dead branches, you keep that stuff away. And if you can ensure that, you will have a garden that can help you resist the worst impacts of a catastrophic fire. So this is a demonstration garden, and we've tried to design it so that different people with different gardening tastes can get something out of it. So we have a native garden, a productive garden, a cottage garden, and a succulent garden. And all of them are demonstrating that you can have whatever themes that you want, but you can still follow those Firewise principles. So it's so important as Australia really comes to terms with the increased risks of fire that we start to put in place Firewise gardens. And the beautiful thing is we're not asking people to compromise on their designs and their desire to have gardens. What we're saying is, if you use the right principles, you can have a garden that can help you, protect you during those times of crisis. Beautiful stuff by Woodsy there. That's his gorgeous piece there. And that hopefully gives you some idea on what we can do to transform those landscapes. I wanted to finish off by talking about some of the final things we can do to create that water-wise, fire-wise, and fertilize-wise landscape. And I was going to show you some demonstrations here. So what I wanted to start with was, firstly, growing things in pots. Oh, there's a noise you don't want to hear every day. So here I've got a gorgeous plant in a pot, and I wanted to show you some of the key things about those magnificent things that we can grow in our landscape. Bear with me a sec. And there are so many fantastic things that are in that mix. So this is a gorgeous Dianella that we have growing. And if anyone knows the Dianella, these are beautiful plants. Dianella, the suburb, is actually named after these beautiful native plants. It's a great example of a plant that has been bred and cultivated probably for about 30 years now. So whereas we used to just get the Dianella in the bush, there are now so many different varieties of the Dianella. Again, they've been tweaked and honed. This one's called Silver Streak. So you can see that it's got this variegated foliage. And I love the Dianella because it's just one of my favorite go-to plants. It's super tough, super tough. It'll survive and thrive on 1 watering or less a week. So, you know, water-wise, first 11, no problem there. It grows in full sun. It grows in full shade. It's a great plant. If you're a real cheapskate, as it starts to grow, it creates these great rhizomes. So you can cut it up and then divide it and put it into other parts of the garden. And it has these beautiful little purple yellow flowers and these little purple berries. So it's a gorgeous plant. It will attract a lot of native insects and birds to your garden. And I've grown it in this pot because, again, this was a part of the garden where I just couldn't get anything to grow. It was under the big roots of a tree. I needed something to lift the garden. But the important thing is when you're growing plants in pots, you need to remember that they should grow in a potting mix. It's a bizarre thing to say, but there is a big difference between a soil improver and a potting mix. Now, a potting mix is designed for pots, and what it has in it is they put coarse river sand, and they do that for drainage, because once you put a plant in a pot, it's only got a small hole at the bottom for drainage. So you can very quickly get waterlogged conditions. So when you're putting plants in pots, use potting mix. And this is the same for your raised beds, and I'll talk about growing veggies in a moment. But the important thing to keep in mind is that once you have something growing in a pot, that plant is now totally dependent on you for everything that it needs. It can't grow out in all directions like a plant growing in your full garden. So most plants will grow in pots. That's the principle of bonsai. But again, you need to know that you're servicing all of its needs. Keep in mind, potting mix will get horrifically water repellent. So you must use your wetting agents, as we said before, at least 3 times a year. So I'm putting some wetting agent on here now, and I would water this in with my watering can or the hose, and that will then make sure that the water is going into the soil. A bit of a hot tip to know whether your plant is water repellent or not: if you pour the water on and then it is instantly coming out the bottom, all that's happened is the water has gone in and just gone down the sides of the pot and out the bottom. Your plant is getting nothing at all out of that process. So use your wetting agent in your pots at least 2 to 3 times a year. That'll make a profound difference. And remember, those plants are going to need fish and seaweed and fertilizer, because they can't get their nutrients from anywhere else. So I'm just giving these guys a little bit of fertilizer as well. Again, a good slow release fertilizer with lots of trace elements. And if you're growing food, I'll do a food demonstration soon. It's very, very important that you feed them more often. But this guy, once a year, should be totally fine. You can see he's really healthy, or she, and it's not really needing much work. The other thing to remember is that in pots, I generally recommend putting some form of insulation on the inside of the pots, because these pots, firstly, they wick and they will lose water out of them. So clay, unless it's sealed, these terracotta pots are beautiful, but unless they're sealed and you can get a really good glaze to put on them to seal them, they're just going to keep wicking water out, so your plants can dry out very quickly. I recommend putting air cell or core flute plastic on the inside of my pots, particularly, again, facing north. Again, when you know where the compass is working for you, because to the north, you're going to get huge amounts of that summer sun hitting that side. It gets really, really hot, and that heat is transferred in, and therefore those plants can really struggle in those situations. So some form of insulation on the inside of the pots will make a massive difference. And then, very, very importantly, in summer, the bigger the pot, the more important it is. I put some sort of shade cloth on the outside of the pots over the summer. And that, again, is going to protect those plants from the extremes of our semi-arid climate. Such a powerful thing to do. I love using pots. And you would have seen in that video that we showed you, there was a few really interesting landscape features that we considered and used. One is corten steel planters. So these are big rusty colored planters. I use a lot of them now. I love them, and they naturally rust. It's made out of the same material as sea containers, but it's designed to rust. They don't break down. I don't know how it quite works, but they will last at least 30 to 40 years, and they go a beautiful, deep, sort of dried blood red, and you can grow beautiful plants in them, but they get so hot in summer. So again, insulation on the inside and insulation on the outside. One of the other things you would have seen in that presentation or that little film was the gabions. I love gabions. Gabions are those wire baskets that we fill with rubble. They're an amazing thing to put into gardens, and we talked about them last week in the second webinar that we did. So the gabions, you can buy these from places like Creation Landscape, Strata Green, Bunnings sell them as well. So they're wire cages, and you put them together, and then you can fill them with anything. I generally use lots of recycled rubble, little bits of pottery, and they can look beautiful in the garden. They're indestructible, they're fireproof. You can put them where you want. You don't want people to be driving on your verge, and they become wonderful Maharaja palaces for lizards and skinks. So they're fantastic habitat, because remember, you can try and have the greatest garden in the world, but if you've got marauding cats, And dogs, they can be doing massive amounts of damage to your beautiful plants. So it's really, really important that you make sure that your gardens are designed so that you have these places where animals can escape from the worst impacts of those predators. And the biggest, worst predator that we have in Australia is the feral cat. And from my perspective, it might sound a bit controversial, but if a cat is out at night, and it's not locked indoors, it's now feral. It is out killing. And one of our presenters, and if you listen to the website, Web Talk last week, Mike and Mandy Banford, wonderful ecologists who presented for us, they did an autopsy on a dead cat. And in its stomach was 37 lizards and skinks that it had caught that night. And that's Moggy. That's your beautiful cat with a bell. They are still extraordinary hunters. So whatever you can do to create that safe zones for them would be fantastic. So I've had a question, would you recommend insulation on wine barrels too? Absolutely. They can still get hot, not quite as hot as the terracotta or the steel, but definitely I do recommend putting that shade cloth, 90% shade cloth over the outside, and that will make a big difference. So you can grow many different things in pots. It's such a fantastic way to lift your garden. And again, I love having different heights in my garden. And one of my favorite design techniques that I learned from the wonderful Sabrina Hahn is, firstly, when you're walking around the nursery looking at plants, pick up plants that you like and put them close together. And just have a look at how they look, and just even look at the different colors and textures of plants. So you can see here a mother-in-law tongue, a bit of a daggy plant, but super tough. And you can see the contrasts in colors and shapes. There's some beauty in being able to change and change the shape. One thing I know about landscaping, and it's one of the great design maxims again, is that gardens that are beautiful also have intrigue and mystery about them. So they have curves, they have hidden areas. You don't know what you're going to find when you go around a corner, or they'll have a swale or a dune and another area that's secluded. Good landscapes, beautiful landscapes are constantly surprising you with something different. The most boring landscapes are flat with just a square or rectangle bit of artificial turf or lawn. That's a pretty boring landscape. The brain is not really going to get excited by that kind of thing. But when you start to change it up with different heights, shapes, colors, textures, you start to create landscapes where people want to spend time, where you create that wow factor. And of course, it's going to increase the value of your property as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about growing food, because that's an important part of the process. And we've lost our bag. Did that bag go outside, Woodsy? The big green bag, did that go out?
Sure, I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Sorry, if you don't mind passing it. Sorry. Okay, so there's lots of different ways that, oh, that's probably not great for your back. There's lots of different ways that you can grow food, and I passionately encourage you to grow your own food. It's a beautiful thing to be able to do. So these are grow bags. You can get grow bags in lots of different places, but you can see this one's a bit tired. It's a bit water repellent now, and I can prove that. We'll pour a bit of water on. Again, you can see the water is just running off because, again, the more organic matter you add to any of your garden beds, the more you're going to get that water repellency. And our food growing areas, they're going to add more organic matter to it. So if we want to grow our food in bags, you might be 10 stories up in South Perth. You can still grow beautiful food in small areas. So you can get grow bags. You might have raised garden beds, but the principle is still the same. So I'm going to add a few things to get this to grow and be able to grow some wonderful plants for us. So again, remember, this is grown crops. So this originally was growing some beautiful summer veggies for me. It's exhausted. It's done back-to-back marathons. It's grown beautiful food for me. It's now time to replenish it and to help it come back to life. So I'm going to add a few different things to make it grow. Firstly, I'm going to add some beautiful rock dust. And this has got a beautiful mix in it. It's got blood and bone. It's got rock dust. What's rock dust? People talk about rock dust. You might have heard them talk about it. It's amazing stuff. So what it is, and we're going to sort of delve into a bit of a geology lesson now. The best soils in the world come, generally speaking, from parts of the world that were under ice 10 to 12,000 years ago. Okay, so we know that as those glaciers retreated about 10 to 12,000 years ago, they basically crushed up massive amounts of rock. And that became the building blocks for the beautiful, deep, rich soils that you see in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm thinking about Europe, I'm thinking about England, I'm thinking about North America, these extraordinary soils. Now, they were under ice, and that really shut down a lot of their ecological evolution at that time. And my voice has changed because there's so much bacteria and chemicals that are being, natural chemicals that are being released because I'm going into this living soil. But in our part of the world, we didn't get glaciation. We just were constantly baking and quietly evolving. That's why we have such unique plants and animals, because we just didn't get that hibernation, if you like. And so we have diverse ecosystems, but we have very poor soils. So rock dust is about simulating that process of glaciation. It's a pretty cool thing to be able to do. Okay, so I've added some rock dust. I've added some good blood and bone, good organic slow release. Okay, just to interject for a moment, so the question is, what paint would you recommend for a terracotta potter? If you go to Dawson's or Bunnings, there are specially designed paints that are for terracotta pots. They're called glazes. Sometimes you can get them as sprays as well. Okay, so I'm adding some beautiful compost in as well. But first, I'm going to probably grow or show you how to grow the easiest plants in the world. I love this one. So if you want to get kids into gardening, the easiest thing that you can do is to get them growing potatoes. So these are seed potatoes. So seed potatoes are those that have been bred to give you high productivity performance. So you can go again to places like Dawson's, and they have a range of different seed potato that are for sale right now. So you put these seed potatoes in, you can cut them and have an eye. So you just need to make sure that you have an eye. That's one of the eyes there. And that's what the plant will grow through. But I'm happy to put these into here. So I'm going to put 4 of these into this garden bed. So these bags like this are designed to be able to grow 3 or 4 beautiful plants. So I'm putting these in nice and deep. I'm starting to improve that soil. I put some nice material back into there. I'm going to put I'm going to put a bit more of my fertilizer into there again, because these are food growing plants. They're going to need nutrients to grow. And again, it's slow release, it's organic, and it's got those trace elements. But I've got good drainage. I put some potting mix in, but I'm also now going to add my beautiful compost. So that compost is being put onto here, and I'm making a nice mess in my office. Very, very important to put this in. And that's going to make a wonderful space for our plants to grow. And again, what we're doing is we are creating the conditions for our plants to thrive and flourish. So I'm mixing that onto the soil surface. I'm going to put a little bit more of that food onto there for those plants. Again, that beautiful mix of blood and bone. And I mentioned some of the really, really good fertiliser companies that are out there in Perth. So these are West Australian companies that are coming up with products that really reflect the changes. We now know that we can't just keep using fast-acting chemical fertilizers. They just don't work in our sands, and they are killing the biological life of our soil. So companies like Bailey's, Rich Grow, my favorites, Grow Safe, No Frills, are all producing wonderful products that are organically based. Eco Growth is another fabulous company, and they're producing these wonderful products that are designed for the conditions that we have here. And when I first started doing these workshops 25 years ago, there was no way you could get clay. There was no way that you could get good chemical, that you could get good organic fertilizers, but that's changed so much. So it's wonderful that these companies are reflecting all of this. So we've got a good mix in there. We've got lovely soil here. Again, I'm just putting a little bit more of that into that mix, which is going to allow those plants to flourish. Every couple of weeks, I would give this a fish and seaweed solution. And then I put on top beautiful pea straw mulch. Again, this is not a great mulch for your native plants or the rest of your garden. It's not, but it's fabulous for our food growing plants. So that's a beautiful mix. So by putting, man, that's strong. Hope I don't get Legionnaire's disease. So the important thing I have here is, and in all seriousness, if you are at all concerned about your lung capacity, it's probably a good idea to wear a mask. I don't wear gloves. I'm a big fan of making sure my hands are in the dirt. But if you do have any respiratory weaknesses, then it's worth wearing a good mask. We all know about wearing masks at this time of our life. So what I've done is put up my beautiful seed potatoes into here. I've improved the soil. I've dealt with the water repellency. I've added some more clay. I've added some more of that beautiful mix of nutrients. I give it fish and seaweed solution. And because it's got handles, the beautiful thing about the handles is that I can move this around. One of the things I love to say to people is, if you think about plants, how many hours of sunlight do they need a day to get the amount they need to photosynthesize? It's generally about 6 to 8 hours a day. That's it. It's all they need. In the middle of summer, your plants are getting anywhere from 14 to 16 hours. So, and just hold that for a moment. I've had a question. How do I know whether I need to add clay to my raised garden bed? Beautiful question. Well, you just do the squeeze test that I did a little earlier. So if you can wet your soil and you can squeeze it in your hand, release the pressure, and it stays in that beautiful shape, it's cool. You can add too much clay. You definitely can. That's why I said in my talk and in the video, start at 5 kilograms. And if that's not working, it's not staying in a shape, add a little bit more. But you can add too much clay and you can turn it into a tennis court if you're not careful. So you can have too much of a good thing. So start at 5, and if you need, then gently or slowly, incrementally build it up. But you'll know if you do the squeeze test and it just falls apart, you need to add the clay. Okay, so this garden bed that we have here, we need to remember that in summer, particularly summer, again, semi-arid, tough conditions. Again, if plants could talk, they would say they hate Perth, particularly between about the middle of November and the end of March. It's an incredibly tough plant condition that we have here. So your plants are getting anywhere from 14 to 16 hours of sunlight a day in the middle of summer, and they need 6 to 8. So what I would recommend is, if they're in bags, move them so they only get the morning and the afternoon sun, which is fantastic. Move them around. If you are growing your plants in bigger garden beds, again, if you've got raised beds, I love the idea of raised beds, but remember with raised beds, you really, even if you're getting beautiful big raised beds like this, again, it's only the top 30 centimeters that needs to be good soil. You can fill the bottom section with yellow sand or poor gray sand, because most of the roots of your food plants are not going to go deeper than this. I always say it's a great place to bury a body. No one will ever think of looking there. So it's a great place if you're thinking of what you need, someone you need to bump off, but it's that top 30 centimeters. Again, if you've got those beautiful raised beds that are corrugated iron, they're magnificent, but you must line them because they get really hot. So if you can't move your veggie gardens around because they're static, that's when I recommend putting a 30% shade cloth over. So in my garden beds, I don't have them anymore because we're putting eco apartments where my veggie beds were. But when we put them back in again, we put a 30% shade cloth, and we had our poles, and we would just pull this over the top because, again, those plants need some respite. Dappled shade will work really well. You can put trees in that space as well. But remember that if you have trees and you have your raised beds, trees are not stupid. They very quickly work out where you've been putting water and nutrients, and they will try and steal as much of that goodie, that nutrient mix that you're putting into the soil. So if you are putting your trees, your veggie gardens near big trees, I'd be putting some sort of weed matting underneath, because otherwise those roots will plunder that beautiful supply of nutrients that you have. Very, very important. You could, if you wanted to, put a few things like petunias on top, and then the potatoes will grow through and overtake that if you don't just want to look at bare things at the moment. One of the other things that I'd say when you are looking at growing food plants, and I passionately hope that you do, you need to remember that you move into a space and a sphere where you're growing plants that everything loves food growing plants. You do, lace, or all sorts of pests like that food too. So you need to remember that you can have the best suite of seedlings or seed potatoes, but the difference between those starting off and them producing beautiful food for you is totally dependent on how well you manage them. So one of the big things you need to remember is pests and disease. Food-growing plants are going to always be predated upon by a range of different pests. And the suite of pests is really only limited by your imagination. It changes with the seasons, it changes with the year. We are bringing new pests inadvertently into the country all the time. That's why quarantining is so important, but still things slip through. Okay, so when it comes to pest and disease control, I've talked about the pyramid already. There's a pyramid of control strategies for pests and diseases for your garden. We call it integrated pest management, IPM, and it's a very powerful process to help you grow food-growing plants and reduce the need for chemical intervention. If you're going to grow food at home, why on earth would you grow it using large amounts of chemicals? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. The reason why you want to do it is so you can grow beautiful food that you know is not going to be contaminated with pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and miticides. As an aside, if you're buying food from the supermarket, conventional produce, which is cheaper, yep, but you need to accept that it will have residues of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, miticides, because the only way the commercial grower can get it to market blemish-free and acceptable by the big food chains is that they've used those preemptive strikes to keep away pests and diseases. Blemish is just essentially some pest that's been able to attack that food. So if it comes to the shop blemish-free, it's had a chemical barrier that's prevented that from happening. So we need to accept that. That's why organic food is so much better for you, but it is more expensive because it takes more to actually get those to grow. Okay, so if you're growing it at home, remember the integrated pest management pyramid. And it's a nice summary of everything we've talked about tonight as we're wrapping up. If we look at the bulk of what that triangle represents, the biggest chunk is building up the soil. Remember one of my first slides, healthy soil gives you healthy plants, and healthy plants are going to be more resilient against the biggest threats of pest and disease. Make no mistake, it's the biggest thing that you can do to make your plants healthy. I always say that long before Bayer, Monsanto, and all the other companies that peddle chemicals, plants were having to learn how to defend themselves. They can't run away, they can't hiss or snarl at a pest or predator. They have a range of subtle defense mechanisms. But all of those kick in when they're growing in good, healthy soil. So that's why we spend so much time building up that soil. Choose the right plants, put them in well, and that's going to be a big part of that. So good, healthy soil, making sure that it's got a suite of nutrients, it's microbially active, and you've dealt with the water repellency. So they're getting the hydration. Remember, plants are not going to be able to repel diseases and pests if they're dying of thirst. So they have to be strong and resilient. The second thing is that your garden should be part of an ecosystem. If you're going to try and grow food, then you have to grow an ecosystem, because the greatest ally you have are the natural predators. Lacewings, hoverflies, ladybirds, native insects, willy wagtails, frogs. All of them are going to be working 24 hours a day, most of them, 7 days a week, no enterprise bargain agreements, no strikes, nothing. They're just going to be working slowly to keep the worst of the pests and disease under control. And of course, they bring your garden alive. So linking in with that, that means we have our beautiful native plants. We have a suite of them as a framework, because that is going to attract and allow those predators to not only visit your garden, but hopefully breed in your garden. And that's a really important part of this process. When you start to see them living and breeding in your garden and living there, that's when you've got the greatest chance of keeping pests and disease under control. Very, very important. So if despite all of that, and putting the shade sails and the shade cloth over in the summer so they're not too stressed, you've got good windbreaks or shelter belts to stop the hot, dry winds marauding across the landscape, the irrigation is working well. If you do have pest and disease, you probably have failed to do one other really important thing in your food growing, which is to have a diversity of plants. Food growing systems in your garden should be a mix of food growing plants and aromatic plants, bird attracting and insect attracting plants. So they look beautiful, but they're diverse. If you want to have pests maraud across your landscape, you just put your plants into very poor sandy soil with no protection, use fast-acting chemical fertilizers and just put row upon row upon row upon row of the same plant, and I guarantee you'll have pests everywhere. So if that's what you want to do and spend a lot of money on pest and disease control, you do the exact opposite of everything we've talked about today. So grow a diversity of plants in that landscape. And then finally, if you do find there is still some pest and disease attack in plague proportions, there are two ways you can go to get results and success. South Perth, the Ag Department, how do you get rid of grasshoppers without using pesticides? Well, Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture, used to say, get guinea fowl. But if you can't get guinea fowl, that's going to be a bit hard. There are a range of natural products that you can use. One is called EcoNeem, and that's a product that's available through Bunnings. Dawson's, again, is my favorite, and you can use that product, EcoNeem. That actually inhibits their ability to get the mechanism that teaches or tells them they're hungry and to eat food, which is pretty cool. So finally, the South Perth Department of Ag has the free Pest and Disease Information Service. So if you go to the Ag Department website and put in Pest and Disease Information Service, you can download fantastic fact sheets, but you can send in images or samples of a pest or a disease, and they can give you good targeted results. Finally, you can go to Dawson's again. Take in a sample. You can't just explain it. Try and bring in the culprit and or the damage, and they should be able to give you good advice, targeted advice. And the real sweet spot is they'll recommend low toxicity products. Gone are the days when you use Roga, malathion, DDT, and dieldrin. These are incredibly toxic products, which are not only deleterious to the pests, but everything else in the garden and including us as humans. So if you are going to use a product, that's the final bit of that triangle, it's going to be a low toxicity product. So there are lots of great companies now that produce these really low toxicity products so that you can have what's called integrated pest management. You grow good food that is going to be nutritionally dense, but it's not contaminated with those impacts. So there you go. In summary, I hope that today's been able to inspire you to be water wise, fertilize wise, and fertilize wise. I'd like to thank the City of South Perth and my amazing team behind the cameras for allowing us to have this fantastic event. And if you have enjoyed today, please do the poll. And if you have enjoyed it, it is a sensational thing to just drop an email to the CEO or the mayor of South Perth and say, thank you for putting on these events, because it ensures that there's going to be funding for more of these events into the future. Again, if you don't use it, you lose it. But I'd like to thank you very much. And I hope this has allowed you to get some of the skills and the techniques to go out there and create a beautiful, productive, sustainable, safe, and resilient landscape, which will be awesome for you and your family, but hopefully will be a wonderful indicator out there into the wider community of what is possible as WA moves towards that more sustainable and resilient future. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening and get gardening tomorrow. Thank you.